At my wife's funeral, her boss grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my coat, and whispered, "They did not just betray her, Calvin, they destroyed her." When I opened the printout he shoved into my pocket, my wife's final words revealed that my own flesh and blood had framed her, drained her accounts, and left her to die entirely alone. My name is Calvin Hughes. I am 68 years old. For 40 years I worked as a shipyard crane operator on the eastern seaboard. When you spend 4 decades of your life suspended 100 feet in the air moving 50-ton steel shipping containers and iron beams, you learn a few fundamental things about weight. You learn about patience. You learn about precision. You learn exactly how to hold steady when the wind is howling and the massive load suspended beneath you threatens to swing out of control. You learn that one wrong move, one tiny lapse in concentration can bring the whole structure crashing down and cost people their lives. I always prided myself on my steady hands. I never dropped a load. I never let the heavy weight beat me. But today, standing on the edge of a muddy rectangle carved into the wet earth, the weight I was carrying was something no steel cable could ever support. Today I was burying my Beatrice, my wife of 42 years, my heart, my absolute center of gravity. Beatrice and I built a life out of nothing but grit and loose change. We started in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, eating beans and rice for years so we could save for a modest mortgage. I worked double shifts at the docks, my hands permanently stained with grease and rust, coming home with an aching back and calloused fingers. She worked her way up from a bank teller to a senior bookkeeper at a major logistics firm. We did it all for our kids. We skipped vacations, we wore patched clothes, and I drove a truck with a busted heater for 10 years just to pay for out-of-state college tuitions. We wanted them to have the education we never had, the opportunities we could only dream about. And looking at that polished mahogany casket, listening to the heavy rain drumming against the dark wood, I felt a physical tearing sensation in my chest. They say grief is just love with nowhere to go. I had 42 years of love backed up inside me, choking my throat, blurring my vision. The sky above the cemetery was a bruised, heavy gray. A cold autumn rain fell in endless sheets, soaking through the black wool of my overcoat, chilling me straight to the bone. Underneath the green funeral tent, the crowd was thick. Beatrice was a deeply beloved woman in our community. But my eyes were fixed only on my family, my children, my anchors. With Beatrice gone, I believe they were the only things tethering me to this earth. I watched my daughter Chloe, she is 35 now, beautiful, successful, standing there in a black designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. She was leaning heavily against her husband, Declan Croft. Declan is 38, a white man with a slick haircut and the kind of aggressive, polished confidence that comes from moving other people's money around. He is a corporate wealth manager, the kind of guy who wears a tailored suit even on a Sunday afternoon. He drove a vehicle that cost more than my annual pension. I had never completely understood Declan's fast-paced world of hedge funds and hidden portfolios, but I swallowed my pride because I respected how he provided for my daughter. Right now, Declan had his arm wrapped tight around Chloe, shielding her from the rain with a large black umbrella. Chloe was sobbing loudly, her theatrical cries echoing over the sound of the falling rain, her face buried deeply in Declan's expensive shoulder. He stroked her hair, looking down at the casket with a grim, sorrowful expression. It moved me. It truly did. Seeing how much he seemed to care for my little girl in her darkest hour made me feel a profound surge of gratitude. I told myself she was in good hands. On Chloe's other side stood my son Jamal. He is 32, a quiet boy who always kept his emotions locked up tight in a vault. He was my shadow growing up, but as a man he always seemed a bit lost, always searching for a financial shortcut instead of putting in the hard work. Today he looked utterly devastated. He stared straight ahead at the brass handles of the casket. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping, rain mixing with the silent tears streaming down his face. He looked entirely broken. My heart ached all over again just looking at him. I wanted to reach out to pull all 3 of them into my arms to tell them that their father was still here. I silently promised Beatrice right then and there, as the preacher read from the book of Psalms, that I would use my remaining years to protect them. I would give them whatever they needed. I would be the solid steel foundation they could lean on. I had no earthly idea that the foundation of my family was already rotten to the absolute core. The preacher's voice droned on, speaking about Beatrice's kindness, her fierce dedication to her family, her sharp mind, and her warm spirit. Every word was true, but none of it captured the daily reality of her. It did not capture the way she hummed old soul records while cooking Sunday dinner. It did not capture the way she meticulously balanced our household checkbook every single Friday night at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on the very edge of her nose. Beatrice was a woman of numbers and hard facts. She believed in absolute honesty. She believed in transparency. She was the most principled person I ever knew. To think that her heart, that strong, faithful heart, had simply given out in her sleep was a reality I was fiercely struggling to swallow. The doctors said it was sudden cardiac arrest. They said it happens sometimes. The silent stress of aging, they called it. But Beatrice had always been so healthy, so vibrant, so full of life. As the service finally concluded, the damp crowd slowly began to disperse. People filed past me offering wet handshakes, murmured condolences, and sympathetic nods. I nodded back automatically, my responses purely mechanical. Thank you for coming. Yes, she was a wonderful woman. Thank you for your prayers. Chloe and Declan were receiving condolences a few feet away, Jamal standing quietly behind them, like a ghost. I was about to walk over to comfort them when I noticed a man hanging back near the edge of the cemetery path, waiting completely still under the dripping branches of an old oak tree. It was Victor Thorne. Victor owned the massive logistics firm where Beatrice had worked for the last 2 decades. He was a vastly wealthy man, usually projecting an air of absolute command and authority. But today, Victor looked completely wrong. He was not acting like a dignified boss paying his respects to a long-time loyal employee. He was pacing slightly, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a cornered animal. He wore no umbrella, letting the freezing rain soak right through his expensive trench coat. His eyes darted nervously toward the funeral tent, specifically locking onto Declan. When the crowd thinned out enough, Victor finally moved. He did not walk toward me with the slow, respectful pace of a mourner. He closed the distance quickly, his steps hurried and incredibly anxious. I reached out my calloused hand to greet him, expecting the usual hollow words of comfort. But Victor did not shake my hand. Instead, he stepped uncomfortably close, invading my personal space. He grabbed my left arm. His grip was not comforting. It was brutally painful. His fingers dug into the thick, wet wool of my coat with the desperate, white-knuckled strength of a man who is entirely terrified. I looked down at his face. Victor was sweating despite the freezing rain. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. He glanced over his shoulder again, his gaze locking onto Declan's back for a fraction of a second before snapping back to me. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee and pure, unadulterated anxiety radiating off him. He did not offer condolences. He did not say he was sorry for my loss. Instead, he shoved his other hand violently into my deep coat pocket. I felt the crisp edge of folded paper slide roughly against my interior lining. Victor's voice was a harsh, ragged whisper barely audible over the relentless drumming of the rain. They did not just betray her, Calvin. They destroyed her. I froze. My mind could not process the words. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant to ask if the grief had driven him out of his mind, but Victor's grip tightened on my arm, one last agonizing time, silencing me completely. He stepped back instantly, raising his hands in a fake apologetic gesture, as if we had just exchanged a normal, sorrowful greeting. Before I could even form a single word, he turned and walked away. No, he did not walk. He almost ran. He hurried down the wet asphalt path, his head ducked low, constantly checking over his shoulder until he disappeared into the maze of parked luxury cars. I stood there with the freezing rain beating against my face, my heart suddenly hammering violently against my ribs. What did he mean? Who destroyed her? I looked over at my family. Declan was gently helping Chloe put on her heavy winter coat. Jamal was holding the large umbrella over them, ensuring they stayed dry. They looked like a perfect, tragic picture of family grief. I reached my hand into my pocket, and my rough fingers brushed against the folded paper Victor had shoved there. It felt like a live electrical wire. Suddenly, the graveyard felt suffocating. The sympathetic looks from lingering guests felt heavy and oppressive. I needed to be alone. I needed to see exactly what was on that paper. I walked over and told Chloe I needed a moment to gather myself. I told them I would meet them at our house later for the family reception. Declan offered to drive me, his voice smooth and dripping with practiced concern, but I waved him off. I needed the quiet, I told them. They nodded easily, accepting the excuse of a broken, grieving widower. I turned my back on my wife's grave and walked toward the distant parking lot. My old Ford pickup truck was parked near the very back of the lot, far away from the sleek sedans and imported SUVs. I climbed into the cab, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind me. The noise of the outside world was instantly muted, replaced by the hollow, echoing drumming of the rain on the metal roof. My hands, the hands that had flawlessly operated massive, dangerous machinery for 40 years, were shaking so violently I could barely insert the key into the ignition. I did not start the engine. I reached over and firmly pressed the lock button on the door. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air in the cab smelling of old coffee and worn leather, and reached deep into my pocket. I pulled out the folded printout. It was a standard sheet of printer paper, slightly crumpled from Victor's frantic, sweaty grip. I reached up and turned on the overhead dome light. The dim yellow glow illuminated the page. It was an email. The sender was Beatrice Hughes. The recipient was Victor Thorne. I read the timestamp. 2 a.m. She had been lying right next to me in our bed. I was sleeping, exhausted from a long day, and she was awake in the dark, typing a desperate message to her boss instead of waking me up. Why? Because she was protecting me. Because she knew my temper. Because she knew if she told me what was happening, I would have torn Declan apart with my bare hands right there in our living room. I smoothed the creases of the wet paper against the steering wheel. My chest felt like it was trapped in a hydraulic vise. I forced my aging eyes to focus on the black ink. The very first line stopped the breath entirely in my lungs. It read verbatim, "Calvin, if Victor is giving you this, it means my heart finally gave out. But it was not natural. Declan is framing me, and our children are helping him." The world inside the cab of my truck ceased to exist. The rain outside vanished. The sound of my own breathing vanished. I read the terrifying words again and again. Declan is framing me. Our children are helping him. The paper trembled violently in my calloused hands. The heavy, crushing weight of sorrow and grief that had anchored me to the ground all week suddenly evaporated, completely burned away, and replaced by something entirely different. It was a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. My beautiful wife, the brilliant woman who had been my true north compass for 4 decades, had died terrified and alone in our home, believing that the very children we starved ourselves to raise had fed her to the wolves. I slowly looked up through the rain-streaked windshield toward the cemetery gates. Declan's sleek black SUV was just pulling out onto the main road, carrying my weeping daughter and my silent son. The people I loved most in the world. The people I had just sworn on a Bible to protect. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They were not my anchors. They were the storm. The rain hammered against the roof of my old Ford like a fist. I sat there in the freezing cab, the engine off the air growing thick with my own ragged breaths. The crumpled piece of paper in my hand felt heavier than any steel beam I had ever hoisted. I stared at the stark black ink, my eyes tracing the letters until they blurred, trying to make sense of a reality that was entirely impossible. But Beatrice was a woman of numbers. She did not make mistakes. She did not exaggerate. If she wrote these words, they were the absolute terrifying truth. I forced myself to read past the first line. The email was long typed in the dead of night, a desperate confession from a woman who knew she was running out of time. Beatrice explained everything with the cold, meticulous precision of a senior bookkeeper. She wrote about how Declan had come over to the house a few months ago, claiming he needed to borrow her home office computer to run some advanced financial modeling software for his wealth management firm. He had smiled that slick, practiced smile of his. He had brought her favorite pastries. He had acted the part of the perfect, helpful son-in-law. But while he was sitting at her desk, he was not running models. He was installing a remote access backdoor into her secure work terminal. Beatrice wrote that $1.5 million had gone missing from Victor Thorne's logistics company. It did not vanish all at once. It was siphoned off in small calculated increments over 3 months, routed through a labyrinth of dummy vendor accounts. But the digital fingerprints, the IP addresses, and the authorization codes all pointed directly to Beatrice's home computer. Declan had used his extensive background in corporate finance to build a perfect, untraceable maze, and he had framed his own mother-in-law to take the fall. The money was being used to cover his catastrophic day trading losses. He was drowning in debt, and he had decided that my wife was going to be his life raft. But Beatrice was too smart. She noticed the discrepancies in the quarterly audits. She traced the ghost transactions. She recognized the routing patterns because she had spent 20 years balancing those exact books. When she realized the digital trail led straight to her own IP address, she knew exactly who had done it. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather groaning under the pressure of my calloused hands. The next paragraphs of the email were the ones that truly stopped my heart. Beatrice did not go to the police right away. She was a mother first. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. She wanted to give our daughter the benefit of the doubt. So, she called Chloe and Jamal to the house while I was working a late shift at the shipyard. She laid the printed ledgers on the dining room table. She confronted them with the truth, expecting shock, expecting outrage, expecting them to turn on Declan. Instead, they turned on her. Beatrice described the sheer terror of that night. Chloe did not cry. Jamal did not demand answers from his brother-in-law. Declan simply sat at the head of my table, pouring himself a glass of water, while Chloe reached across the table and took the ledgers out of her mother's hands. Chloe looked her own mother in the eye and told her she was acting crazy. She told Beatrice that there was no missing money, that the ledgers were perfectly normal, and that she was seeing things that were not there. Jamal, my quiet, agreeable son, chimed in right on cue. He told his mother she had been forgetting things lately. He told her she was getting confused. They sat in my dining room and methodically gaslit a brilliant woman into questioning her own sanity. They told her she was suffering from early onset dementia. When Beatrice threatened to call Victor and the authorities, Declan leaned forward and delivered the final blow. He told her that no one would believe a confused elderly woman who was clearly losing her mind. He told her that he had already spoken to a doctor friend about her declining mental state. They made her feel entirely alone, trapped in her own failing body, surrounded by predators who shared her blood. A cold, shuddering breath tore its way out of my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, but all I could see was Beatrice sitting alone in the dark, typing this email, her heart pounding with a toxic mixture of fear and betrayal. The doctors had told me her heart gave out due to the silent stress of aging. They were wrong. Her heart was crushed. She died terrified, suffocating under the weight of her own children's monstrous greed. They had sold her out to cover a slick corporate thief's gambling debts. Jamal had looked devastated at the funeral today, but I now knew those tears were not for his mother. They were tears of guilt. They were the tears of a coward. I sat in the freezing truck for a long time. The grief that had been drowning me all week began to change. It physically shifted inside my chest. The sorrow evaporated, burned away by a sudden consuming heat. It morphed into a cold, hardened, unyielding rage. It was a familiar feeling. It was the same hyper-focused clarity I used to get when a 50-ton steel beam started swinging out of control in high winds. You do not panic. You do not scream. You lock your hands on the controls, you brace your boots against the floor, and you drop the weight exactly where you want it. I folded the email and placed it carefully into the inner pocket of my suit jacket right next to my heart. I reached out and turned the key in the ignition. The old Ford engine roared to life, a deep rumbling growl that perfectly matched the storm brewing inside me. I put the truck in drive and pulled out of the cemetery. The rain was washing the mud from my tires, but nothing was ever going to wash away what my family had done. I was going to drive home. I was going to walk through my front door, look my daughter in the eye, and demand the truth. I was going to grab Declan by his expensive collar and drag him straight to the police station. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of gray skies and flashing red taillights. My mind raced through 1,000 different confrontations. I thought about the house I was returning to. It was a sturdy brick home I had bought 30 years ago. I had spent countless weekends replacing the roof, upgrading the plumbing, and building a wooden deck in the backyard where Beatrice loved to read her Sunday paper. Every inch of that property was built on my sweat and her careful saving. And now the people who murdered her spirit were sitting inside it wearing black clothes and pretending to mourn. I turned onto my street and parked the truck 3 houses down. I did not want them to hear the engine. I wanted to walk in quietly. I wanted to catch them in their grief, to see the guilt on their faces before I tore their world apart. I stepped out into the freezing rain, ignoring the water seeping into my dress shoes. I walked up my driveway, the wet concrete slick beneath my feet. The house was mostly dark except for the warm amber glow spilling from the living room windows. As I stepped onto the covered front porch, I paused to shake the rain from my coat. I reached for the brass doorknob, fully intending to throw the door wide open. But I stopped. The heavy wooden door was not fully closed. It was cracked open, just a few inches likely left ajar by one of the caterers who had dropped off the funeral food earlier in the afternoon. Through that narrow gap, the sound of the rain was replaced by something else. It was laughter. Not the polite, muffled laughter of people sharing fond memories at a repast. It was a sharp, relaxed, celebratory laugh. It was the sound of a victorious exhale. I froze on the porch, the freezing wind whipping around my shoulders. I pressed my back against the brick siding and slowly shifted my weight, bringing my right eye to the crack in the door. I had a clear view of the formal living room. The fireplace was roaring, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Standing around the mahogany coffee table were Chloe, Declan, and Jamal. They had taken off their heavy winter coats. Declan had loosened his black silk tie. Chloe was leaning against his side, a relaxed, easy posture that looked nothing like the sobbing, devastated daughter I had held at the cemetery just 2 hours ago. In Declan's hand was a crystal tumbler. I recognized the shape of the glass. I recognized the rich, dark amber liquid inside it. It was my 20-year-old reserve bourbon, the bottle I had purchased a decade ago, saving it for a special occasion, saving it to toast my grandchildren one day. Declan was pouring a generous measure into a second glass and handing it to my son. Jamal took the glass, tapping it against Declan's tumbler in a silent, conspiratorial cheer. I held my breath, afraid that the sound of my own lungs would give me away. I watched my daughter take a sip from a wine glass, a small, relieved smile playing on her lips. They were celebrating. On the day we put my wife in the ground, they were drinking my best liquor and celebrating. Declan took a slow, appreciative sip of the bourbon, closing his eyes and nodding. He lowered the glass and looked at my children. His voice carried through the cracked door, clear and sharp over the crackling of the fireplace. "The old man is clueless." Declan laughed, a sound so arrogant it made my blood run entirely cold. We played it perfectly today. He did not suspect a single thing. He was looking at us like we were the victims. Chloe let out a soft sigh, tracing the rim of her wine glass. "I just want this over with, Declan." It was exhausting pretending to cry all afternoon. "When do we finalize the rest of it?" Declan stepped closer to her, wrapping his free arm around her waist. "Friday. Once we get his signature on the estate release forms on Friday, the house is ours, the offshore accounts are unlocked, and he goes straight into the memory care ward next to Mom's empty spot. Dr. Sterling already has the paperwork drafted. One signature and Calvin becomes a ward of the state." Jamal shifted uncomfortably, taking another gulp of the stolen bourbon. "You are sure the doctor will play ball? If Dad tries to fight it, he can be stubborn." "He will not fight anything," Declan said smoothly, his eyes flashing with predatory confidence. "We have spent the last month documenting his decline. We have the fake medical logs. We have the narrative. He is a grieving, broken old man who cannot take care of himself anymore. We are doing the responsible, loving thing by putting him in a home. By the time he realizes what happened to his money, he will be locked in a secure facility with zero access to a phone or a lawyer." I stood completely paralyzed on the wet porch. The freezing rain continued to beat against my back, but I could not feel the cold anymore. I could not feel anything except the horrifying reality of what I was witnessing. They were not just covering up a theft, they were orchestrating my absolute erasure. They were planning to steal my home, drain my finances, and lock me in a psychiatric prison for the rest of my natural life. And my own children, the flesh and blood I had sacrificed my youth to protect, were eagerly assisting the man executing the plan. If I walked through that door right now and started yelling, I would lose. I saw it with total, brutal clarity. I was a 68-year-old grieving widower. Declan was a wealthy, connected corporate manager with a doctor already willing to declare me insane. If I threw a punch, if I raised my voice, if I caused a scene, I would just be handing them the exact evidence they needed to prove I was mentally unstable and dangerous. They would call the police, show them the forged medical documents, and I would be strapped to a gurney before the sun went down. Rage is a useless tool when you are walking into an ambush. I did not need rage. I needed a strategy. I needed absolute, uncompromising precision. I slowly pulled away from the crack in the door. I stepped backward, placing my wet shoes carefully on the porch boards to ensure not a single floorboard creaked. I walked backward down my own driveway, leaving the house I built to the monsters who had invaded it. I got back into the cold cab of my old Ford truck and stared at the steering wheel. Declan thought I was just a weak, uneducated laborer. He thought I was a foolish old man who could be easily discarded. He did not realize that a man who spends his entire life building indestructible frameworks knows exactly where to hit a structure to make it collapse. I was not going to yell. I was not going to cry. I was going to let them think they were winning. And while they were drinking my bourbon and planning my funeral, I was going to build a steel trap that would lock them away for the rest of their lives. The rain poured down in heavy sheets as I stood on the wet wooden planks of my front porch. The freezing water soaked right through my thick wool coat, but I did not feel the cold. I needed the freezing rain to numb the burning fire that was threatening to tear my chest wide open. I had just discovered that my wife had died in absolute terror, believing our own children had framed her for a massive corporate theft. I had just looked through a crack in my own front door and watched my daughter and my son-in-law drinking my best bourbon, celebrating their plan to lock me in a psychiatric ward. My hands were balled into fists so tight my ancient joints ached. For 40 years, I operated massive cranes at the Eastern Seaboard Shipyard. I hoisted 50-ton loads of steel and iron high into the sky. I knew how to lock my muscles. I knew how to hold my breath when the wind howled. I knew how to maintain absolute control when one tiny mistake meant total catastrophe. I took a deep breath of the damp autumn air, and I let all the tension drain out of my broad shoulders. I let my spine curve just a little bit. I let my large hands tremble against my sides. I forced the burning rage behind my eyes to turn into the hollow, vacant stare of a broken, grieving old man. I turned the brass knob and slowly pushed the front door open. The heavy wooden door creaked as it swung inward. The sudden warmth of the house hit my cold face. It smelled like the expensive catered food someone had ordered for the funeral reception. Baked ziti, roasted vegetables, and the faint, lingering scent of expensive cologne. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the lively atmosphere in the living room died instantly. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. The hushed, celebratory whispers evaporated. When I shuffled around the corner into the living room, the three of them were already performing. Declan was standing near the roaring fireplace with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored suit, looking incredibly solemn. Chloe had rushed to the velvet sofa, picking up a balled-up tissue and dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes. My son Jamal was standing near the window, staring out into the dark street, completely avoiding my gaze. Declan was the first to move. He crossed the hardwood floor with wide, hurried steps, wearing a mask of deep, overwhelming concern. "Calvin, you are freezing," he said, his voice dripping with absolute fake sympathy. "You should not have stayed out in that rain so long by yourself. We were getting so worried about you." He reached out and placed his smooth, manicured hands on my wet shoulders. It took every ounce of strength I had built over a lifetime of hard labor not to grab him by the throat and throw him through the front window. His touch felt like poison. But I did not pull away. I let my knees buckle just a fraction of an inch. I let a heavy, exhausted sigh rattle out of my lungs. "I just needed some time, Declan," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I just needed to talk to her one last time before I left the cemetery." Declan nodded slowly, offering me a sad, patronizing smile. "Of course you did, Calvin. Of course you did. Come on now. Let us get you out of this wet coat and into your chair. You need to rest. Your heart has been through too much today." He gently guided me across the living room like I was a fragile piece of glass. He led me to the worn brown leather recliner in the corner, the chair Beatrice had bought for me when I retired from the shipyard. I sank into the soft cushions, letting my head loll back against the headrest. I closed my eyes for a moment, acting as though the simple walk from the front door had completely drained my life force. Chloe hurried into the kitchen and returned a moment later with a steaming mug of tea. She knelt on the expensive rug right beside my chair, holding the mug up to me. "Here you go, Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Drink this. It will warm you up." I looked down at my daughter, my beautiful, smart little girl, the girl I used to carry on my shoulders at the county fair. The girl whose college tuition I paid for by working double shifts until my back felt like it was breaking. She looked back at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely hiding the fact that she was actively planning to lock me in a memory care facility and steal the house we were currently sitting in. I reached out with a shaking hand and took the mug. "Thank you, Chloe," I muttered, taking a slow sip. "You are a good daughter." She smiled a sad little smile and patted my knee. "We are going to take care of you, Dad. You do not have to worry about a single thing anymore. We are going to handle everything." That was the opening they were waiting for. I could feel the energy in the room shift. Declan moved closer to the recliner, standing right behind Chloe. He put a comforting hand on her shoulder and looked down at me with deep, practiced sincerity. "Actually, Calvin, since Chloe brought it up, there is something we wanted to discuss with you," Declan said, his tone gentle and cautious. "We know this is incredibly difficult. We know the pain is fresh. But we also know that staying in this big house surrounded by all of Beatrice's things is only going to make your grief worse." I blinked up at him, playing the confused, exhausted widower. "What do you mean, Declan?" Chloe leaned in closer, resting her hands on the arm of my chair. "Dad," she said softly. "Mom's home office. It is right down the hall. Every time you walk past it, you are going to see her desk. You are going to see her computer and her files, and it is just going to break your heart all over again. Declan and Jamal and I were talking while you were at the cemetery. We want to box up her office for you. We can do it tonight or first thing tomorrow morning. We can pack up all her work files and her computer and put everything in storage. That way you do not have to look at it and relive the pain every single day. The trap was so elegantly constructed I almost wanted to applaud them. To anyone else, it would sound like the ultimate act of familial compassion. Children offering to do the heavy emotional lifting so their elderly father would not have to suffer. But I knew the truth. I had read the final email Beatrice sent to her boss. I knew that Declan had installed a remote access backdoor into Beatrice's home office computer to route his $1.5 million theft. I knew that Beatrice had kept detailed physical ledgers proving her innocence and exposing their fraud. They did not want to save me from emotional pain. They wanted to scrub the hard drives. They wanted to shred the ledgers. They wanted to wipe the IP history and completely obliterate any physical evidence that linked them to the crime before the police or the corporate auditors came knocking. They needed to sanitize that room immediately. I let out a long, trembling breath. I looked away from them, staring blankly at the roaring fireplace. I let a single, real tear slide down my cheek. It was a tear of profound, agonizing heartbreak that my own flesh and blood could be so ruthlessly calculating. "You really think that is best?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Dad," Chloe said quickly, nodding her head. "We really do. It is just too much for you to handle right now. Let us take this burden off your shoulders." I slowly turned my head back to look at them. I nodded weakly, letting my shoulders slump even further. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, you can pack up her office. But I have one request. Just one thing I want to keep with me right now. Anything." Calvin, Declan said eagerly, his eyes lighting up with the thrill of victory. "What do you need?" "Her sewing kit," I said, my voice cracking perfectly. "The old wooden sewing kit she keeps on the bottom shelf of her bookcase." Chloe looked slightly confused. "Her sewing kit, Dad." I nodded, wiping my eyes with the back of my rough hand. "Yes. When we first got married, I only had 2 good work shirts for the shipyard. The steel beams would always snag the fabric and tear the shoulders. We did not have any money to buy new ones. So every Sunday night, Beatrice would sit at that desk, pull out that wooden kit, and stitch my work shirts back together. She did it for years so I could look presentable on the docks. I want to keep that kit in our bedroom. I want to smell the cedar wood and the old cotton. It will make me feel like she is still here taking care of me." Chloe's face softened into an expression of genuine pity. She actually believed my story. She actually thought I was just a sentimental, broken old fool clinging to a box of needles and thread. She looked up at Declan. Declan gave a tiny, imperceptible nod. A wooden box of thread held no danger to his financial schemes. "Of course, Dad," Chloe said softly. "I will go get it for you right now." She stood up and walked down the hallway to Beatrice's office. A few moments later, she returned carrying the heavy vintage cedar sewing kit. She placed it gently onto my lap. I wrapped my arms around the smooth wood, pulling it close to my chest, and buried my face against the lid. I cried quietly, thanking them over and over for being such wonderful children. Declan smiled, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He had secured permission to destroy the crime scene, and all it cost him was an old wooden box. By 11 o'clock that night, the house was entirely silent. Jamal had left to drive back to his apartment. Chloe and Declan had taken the guest bedroom down the hall, exhausted from a long day of fake crying and plotting their hostile takeover of my estate. I sat alone in the master bedroom with the door locked and the heavy curtains drawn tight. The only light came from a small brass reading lamp on my nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cedar sewing kit resting on my lap. Beatrice was a brilliant woman. She spent 20 years tracking corporate logistics and balancing million-dollar accounts. She knew how to hide things in plain sight. She knew that if Declan was trying to frame her, he would eventually try to destroy her files. She also knew that no slick corporate wealth manager would ever look twice at an old woman's box of knitting supplies. I unlatched the brass clasp and opened the lid. The smell of cedar and old fabric filled the quiet room. The top tray was filled with spools of colorful thread metal thimbles and rusted sewing shears. I carefully lifted the top tray out and set it on the bedspread. The bottom compartment held patches of fabric and old buttons. I pressed my thick thumbs against the interior wooden panel at the very bottom of the box. I applied pressure to the bottom left corner exactly the way Beatrice had shown me years ago when she first bought the antique kit at a flea market. The false wooden bottom clicked and popped upward. I lifted the thin cedar panel away. Hidden in the shallow secret compartment beneath the false floor lay a small black flash drive and a tightly bound black leather notebook. My breath caught in my throat. I reached down and picked them up. The notebook was Beatrice's personal handwritten ledger. I could see her neat, precise handwriting covering the pages. I walked over to the small desk in the corner of the bedroom and opened my laptop. I inserted the black flash drive into the port and waited for the folders to load on the screen. There were dozens of files neatly organized and labeled with dates and account numbers. I opened the first file marked Master Ledger Summary. As I read the documents illuminating the dark room with the harsh glow of the screen, the true scope of the horror finally revealed itself to me. Declan had not just stolen $1.5 million from Victor Thorne's logistics company. He had not just framed my wife for corporate embezzlement. The files contained copies of bank transfers routed through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They contained a drafted legal petition ready to be filed with the county court declaring Calvin Hughes completely unfit to manage his own affairs due to severe cognitive decline. But the final document on the drive was the one that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a digital copy of a life insurance policy, a policy taken out on Beatrice Hughes just 6 months ago. The payout was for $2 million. And the sole primary beneficiary listed on the document was not me. It was our daughter, Chloe. They had not just let my wife die from the stress of being framed. They had actively planned for it. They had insured her life and then applied unimaginable psychological pressure until her heart finally gave out. They murdered the woman I loved for a payout. I sat in the dark bedroom staring at the screen as a cold, absolute certainty settled over my soul. They thought I was a broken old man ready to be shipped off to a memory care ward. They had no idea I was about to build a prison out of their own greed and drop the heavy steel straight down on their heads. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in the master bedroom. I sat at Beatrice's small wooden desk, the very same desk where she had spent countless evenings managing our lives, balancing our checkbooks, and planning our future. The house was completely silent. Down the hall, the people who had brought this nightmare to my door were sleeping comfortably under my roof. My thick, calloused fingers hovered over the trackpad. The flash drive I had pulled from the false bottom of the cedar sewing kit was small, black, and completely unassuming. But sitting there in the freezing quiet of the night, it felt like it contained the weight of a collapsing building. Beatrice had always preferred putting pen to paper. She trusted the physical weight of ink. But she was also a brilliant bookkeeper who understood the modern world. She knew that if she was going to prove her innocence, she needed digital evidence. I took a deep, shuddering breath and opened the main directory on the drive. The folders were meticulously organized, labeled with the sharp precision that defined my wife. At first, I simply reviewed the files detailing Declan's massive theft from Victor Thorne's logistics company. Beatrice had tracked the phantom vendors, the routed payments, and the carefully constructed maze of digital wire transfers that Declan had orchestrated using her home network. It was a brilliant and completely evil corporate shell game. But as I clicked into the next folder, simply labeled Joint Accounts, the air in the bedroom seemed to freeze entirely in my lungs. I opened a spreadsheet titled Retirement Portfolio. It was a summary of the financial safety net Beatrice and I had spent our entire adult lives building. Every single dollar in that account was a story of blue-collar sacrifice. It represented the brutal overtime shifts I pulled in the freezing rain at the shipyard operating heavy machinery until my bones ached and my vision blurred. It represented the summer vacations. We never took the winter coats we patched up instead of replacing, and the old vehicles we drove into the ground. We built that nest egg through sheer grit and discipline so we would never, ever be a financial burden to our children. I scrolled down to the final balance line. I blinked, rubbing my tired eyes, thinking the glowing screen was playing tricks on me in the dark. But the numbers did not change. $200,000 was missing. A massive chunk of our life savings had been wiped out in a series of quiet, methodical, untraceable withdrawals over the past 6 months. I searched frantically through the folder, my chest tightening with a sickening dread. I clicked on a scanned legal document attached to the withdrawal records. It was a durable power of attorney. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. The document granted Declan Croft complete and unchecked control over Beatrice's financial and medical decisions. It cited severe, rapid onset cognitive decline as the core reasoning. It officially claimed that Beatrice was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. And at the very bottom of the page, there was a signature. It was Beatrice's signature, but it was shaky, uncertain, completely unlike her usual confident and beautiful script. Beside it was Chloe's signature, signing boldly as a legal witness, officially confirming her own mother's supposed mental collapse. They had used the fake dementia narrative to isolate her. They used it to legally strip away her rights and to quietly drain the very lifeblood we had bled to save. They did not just steal from her boss. They robbed us blind while she was still breathing, while she was sitting right there in her home office trying desperately to prove her own sanity. A deep, agonizing sickness washed over me. I clicked back to the main directory on the flash drive. There was a separate subfolder named Jamal. My hand hesitated over the trackpad. I almost did not want to open it. Jamal, my quiet boy. The son who had stood in the rain at the cemetery today looking utterly destroyed. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball. I double-clicked the folder. Inside was a single devastating bank transfer receipt. $50,000 wired directly from one of Declan's offshore shell accounts into Jamal's personal checking account. The date on the transfer was exactly 4 months ago. I closed my eyes as a memory hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. 4 months ago, Jamal had driven up to our house in a brand new slate gray sports car. I remembered standing on the concrete driveway, wiping dark grease off my hands with a shop rag, asking him how he afforded such a beautiful machine on his modest retail salary. Jamal had smiled, looking me directly in the eye, and told me he had received a massive promotion at work. He told me his boss had finally recognized his true value to the company. I had been so proud of him. I had hugged him and told him that hard work always pays off. It was a complete lie. The car was not a reward for honest labor. It was a $50,000 payout to buy his absolute silence. He had sold out. His own mother watched them gaslight her into an early grave and watched them drain his parents' retirement accounts, all so he could drive around town in a shiny piece of metal. His tears at the cemetery today were not born of grief. They were the desperate, pathetic tears of a coward who knew exactly what kind of monster he had become. The sorrow inside me was completely gone. The burning rage that had ignited on the front porch was no longer a fire. It was a glacier. It was cold, massive, and entirely unstoppable. I went back to the main directory. There was one more folder left to open. It was labeled Immediate Threat. Beatrice had named it that specifically for me. She knew I would find it. She knew I needed to see what was coming. I opened the folder and found a drafted legal petition. It was prepared by a high-priced law firm located downtown. The title of the document read Petition for Appointment of Conservator and Guardian. The proposed ward was Calvin Hughes. The proposed conservator was Declan Croft. I read the legal jargon, my eyes scanning the dense, ruthless paragraphs. The petition claimed that following the sudden and tragic death of my wife, I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. It listed completely fabricated incidents of me leaving the stove on wandering the neighborhood at night and becoming violently agitated with my family members. It stated that for my own physical safety and to protect the remaining financial assets of the estate, I needed to be placed in a secure, full-time memory care facility. Declan and Chloe were planning to strip me of my human rights just like they had done to Beatrice. They were going to lock me in a room with white walls and barred windows, throw away the key, and take ownership of the house I had spent a lifetime maintaining. I scrolled to the bottom of the legal petition. There was a section detailing the strict timeline for submission to the county judge. The deadline to file the paperwork and execute the conservatorship was this coming Friday. Today was Sunday. I had less than 5 days before Declan marched into a courtroom with his slick tailored suit and his forged documents and effectively ended my freedom. 5 days before they dragged me out of my own home. 5 days before they took the house Beatrice and I had loved and filled with memories. The arrogant laughter I had heard through the cracked front door echoed loudly in my ears. They thought they had already won the war. They thought the old crane operator was just going to sit in his leather recliner and cry until the men in white coats came to take him away. But they did not understand the kind of man they were dealing with. When you spend your entire life moving 50-ton loads, you do not panic when the weight drops. You assess the rigging, you check your cables, and you prepare to lift the heavy steel. I closed the legal petition. I needed to see everything. I needed to understand exactly how Beatrice had died. The doctors at the hospital had told me her heart simply gave out in her sleep. They said it was the silent, unavoidable stress of aging. But Beatrice had written in her final email that her death was not natural. I clicked into the final folder on the drive. It was labeled Medical Records. Beatrice had kept a meticulous log of all her doctor visits over the last 12 months. I opened a spreadsheet detailing her appointments, her physical symptoms, and her prescribed medications. For years, Beatrice had seen old Dr. Evans, a kind, careful man who knew our family well. But 3 months ago, there was a sudden glaring shift in the records. Beatrice noted that Declan had insisted she see a new specialist. He claimed he had a close personal connection to the absolute best cardiologist in the city, a man who catered exclusively to high-end clients. Declan said he wanted only the absolute best care for his mother-in-law. I stared at the name of the new doctor glowing on the screen. Dr. Sterling. The exact same name Declan had casually mentioned in the living room while drinking my expensive bourbon. Dr. Sterling already has the paperwork drafted. That is what Declan had said on the other side of the door. The same doctor who was currently preparing to declare me hopelessly insane was the exact same doctor who had taken over Beatrice's cardiovascular care 3 months before her sudden, unexpected heart failure. I looked at the long list of medications Dr. Sterling had aggressively prescribed her. They were complicated chemical names I did not recognize. But I did not need a medical degree to understand what I was looking at. Beatrice did not have a heart attack because of the stress of being framed. Her heart did not fail because she was simply getting older. She was a healthy, vibrant woman. She was medically tampered with. Declan had funneled her to a corrupt doctor on his personal payroll. They had used her new prescriptions to weaken her system to actively mimic the symptoms of severe dementia and ultimately to stop her heart before she could take her flash drive to the federal authorities. My children and my son-in-law had murdered my wife. I sat perfectly still in the dark bedroom. The harsh light of the laptop screen cast long, deep shadows against the walls. The house around me was completely silent. Down the hall, the people who had murdered the only woman I ever loved were sleeping comfortably under my roof. They were dreaming of offshore bank accounts and lucrative real estate sales. They were dreaming of the absolute victory they thought they had secured on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I reached out and gently closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the room into total darkness. I did not feel exhausted anymore. I did not feel the ache in my aging joints or the lingering chill from the cemetery rain. I felt like a machine made of pure cold iron. Declan Croft thought he was a mastermind. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess with an ignorant, uneducated old man. But he had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. He had underestimated the patience of a man who knows exactly how to drop a crushing weight. I was not going to yell. I was not going to call the local police tonight and risk them brushing me off as a grieving, confused widower. I was going to let Friday come. I was going to build a trap so devastating, so legally and financially inescapable, that when the steel finally dropped, it would shatter their lives into a million unrecognizable pieces. I sat in the dark, my hands resting steadily on the wooden desk, and began to plan my wife's absolute justice. Monday morning broke with a pale, washed-out light that barely penetrated the heavy curtains of my bedroom. I had not slept a single minute. I had spent the entire night sitting in the dark, staring at the walls of the house Beatrice and I had turned into a home, feeling the cold, hard iron of truth settle deeply into my bones. When I finally walked down the hallway to the kitchen, I made absolutely sure my steps were slow, shuffling, and heavy. I let my broad shoulders sag under an invisible weight. I let my hands tremble just a fraction of an inch when I reached for the coffee pot. I had moved 50-ton steel beams for a living. Controlling my own muscles to look weak was child's play. Chloe was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping herbal tea and scrolling through her expensive phone. She looked up when I entered, instantly pasting on that fake, sorrowful smile that made my stomach churn with disgust. "Good morning, Dad," she said softly, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "How did you sleep last night?" "I did not sleep much, sweetheart," I replied, making my voice sound thin and reedy. "The house just feels so terribly empty without your mother here. I think I need to get out for a bit. Just take a slow walk down to the community park. Get some fresh air and clear my head." Chloe nodded sympathetically, completely buying the performance. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Dad. Declan is at the office handling some urgent client accounts, and I have some calls to make for the estate arrangements. Take your time. Please be careful on the sidewalks." I thanked her, put on my worn wool coat, and stepped out the front door. The moment the brass latch clicked shut behind me, the frail old man vanished entirely. I straightened my spine. I breathed in the crisp autumn air, my mind working with the mechanical precision of a crane operator preparing for a highly dangerous lift. I did not walk to the park. I walked 3 blocks over, got into my old Ford truck, and started the engine. I had a very specific destination in mind, and I needed to get there before anyone realized I was missing. Dr. Sterling operated out of a high-end, glass-fronted medical clinic in the wealthiest, most exclusive part of the city. He was not a doctor for working-class folks like Beatrice and me. He was a concierge physician, a country club golf buddy of Declan, a man who catered to people with deep pockets and very dark secrets. When I walked into the pristine, sterile waiting room, the receptionist gave me a look of immediate polite dismissal. I did not belong there in my faded work coat and scuffed boots. I approached the front desk, letting my calloused hands shake visibly as I rested them on the polished marble counter. "Excuse me, miss," I said, my voice wavering perfectly. "My name is Calvin Hughes. My wife Beatrice was a patient of Dr. Sterling. She just passed away this weekend." The receptionist softened her expression, tapping quickly at her keyboard. "Oh, Mr. Hughes, I am so very sorry for your tragic loss. How can we possibly help you today?" I looked down at my hands, acting completely lost and overwhelmed. "I am trying to get her affairs in order. The life insurance company is giving me a terrible time this morning. They say they desperately need a full printed copy of her medical records and prescription logs from the last 6 months before they can even process the claim. My son-in-law Declan usually helps me with this kind of complicated paperwork, but he is so busy at his firm today, and I just want to get it done. I do not want to be a burden to him or my daughter. Could I possibly get a copy of her medical file to fax over to them?" The receptionist hesitated, looking at her screen. "Usually we require a formal written request processed through our legal department, but since Dr. Sterling is a close personal friend of your son-in-law, let me see what I can do to expedite this for you." She disappeared down the long carpeted hallway. A few minutes later, Dr. Sterling himself walked out into the lobby. He was a tall, tanned man with perfect teeth and a condescending, effortless smile. He looked at me the way a man looks at a slow, dim-witted animal that has wandered onto his pristine golf course. "Calvin," Dr. Sterling said, extending a smooth, uncalloused hand. "Declan called and told me the tragic news yesterday. Beatrice was a lovely woman. We did everything we humanly could for her heart, but sometimes nature simply takes its inevitable course." I took his hand. His grip was weak and pathetic. "Thank you, doctor," I mumbled, staring blankly at his expensive gold watch. "I am just so confused by it all. The insurance company is confusing me too. They need the paperwork right away. Declan told me you were the absolute best, that you would take care of us." Sterling puffed out his chest, just a fraction, his massive ego easily stroked by the compliment. "Declan is a good man, Calvin. He wants what is best for your family. Of course we can provide the records you need. It is a simple administrative task, and we want to help ease your burden." He waved the receptionist over. "Print the entire file for Mr. Hughes. Let us not make this difficult time any harder on him than it already is." 10 minutes later, I walked out of that gleaming glass clinic with a thick manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. Sterling thought he was placating a senile, grieving old man. He thought he was helping his buddy Declan tie up a loose financial end with the insurance company. He had absolutely no earthly idea he had just handed me the murder weapon. I did not go home. I drove straight across town to the old neighborhood to an independent pharmacy run by a man named Marcus. Marcus and I had known each other for over 30 years. We used to coach Little League baseball together when Jamal was just a young, innocent boy. Marcus was an honest, hard-working man who knew every drug, every chemical interaction, and every dirty trick the pharmaceutical industry ever invented. He was the only medical professional I trusted. I walked into his small, crowded shop, bypassing the front counter and heading straight for the back room where he was counting morning inventory. He looked up, his face immediately breaking into a warm, sorrowful smile. "Calvin," he said, wiping his hands on his white apron. "I heard about Beatrice. I am so incredibly sorry, brother. She was a saint." I bypassed the pleasantries completely. "I need your professional eyes on something, Marcus. Right now. I need you to tell me exactly what is in this file, and I need you to leave nothing out." I dropped the thick manila folder heavily onto his metal desk. Marcus saw the hard, unyielding look in my eyes and instantly recognized that this was not a social call. He pulled up a wooden stool, opened the file, and began scanning the physician logs. At first, he just nodded slowly. He read through her basic vitals, her blood pressure readings, her routine cholesterol levels. Beatrice had minor hypertension for years, a very standard, highly manageable condition for a woman her age. But as Marcus turned the page to the medication logs from the last 3 months, the months right after Declan forced her to switch her care to Dr. Sterling, his face suddenly went completely slack. The color literally drained from Marcus' cheeks. He took off his reading glasses, rubbed his eyes, and put them back on, leaning incredibly close to the paper as if he could not believe the words he was reading. "Calvin Marcus," whispered, his voice thick with absolute horrifying realization. "Who prescribed these specific medications to Beatrice?" "A concierge doctor named Sterling," I replied, my voice sounding like crushed ice. "What is it, Marcus? Tell me exactly what it says on those pages." Marcus looked up at me, his hands physically shaking as he pointed to a cluster of long, complicated chemical names printed on the pharmacy log. "Calvin. These are not standard blood pressure medications, not even close. These are severe, highly aggressive antipsychotics. These are black box drugs heavily restricted by the federal government. They are typically only used for patients suffering from extreme violent schizophrenia or advanced, completely unmanageable psychotic breaks. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw a breath. Explain it to me in plain English, Marcus. What do these drugs do to a perfectly healthy person? Marcus swallowed hard, tapping the paper with a trembling finger. If you give these to a healthy, functioning adult, the side effects are catastrophic. They aggressively alter the brain chemistry. They cause extreme paranoia, severe short-term memory loss, terrifying visual hallucinations, and profound cognitive confusion. They completely and chemically mimic the absolute worst symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. The small pharmacy back room began to spin. I grabbed the edge of the metal desk to steady myself. Declan and Chloe had not just convinced Beatrice she was going crazy. They had actively chemically scrambled her brain so she could not trust her own thoughts. They had poisoned her brilliant mind so no one would believe her when she found the missing $1.5 million. But that is not the worst part, Calvin. Marcus continued, his voice dropping to an agonizing whisper. These specific antipsychotics carry a massive lethal warning label for elderly patients. They put an unbelievable, terrible strain on the cardiovascular system. If you mix these drugs in these specific high dosages and give them to an older woman with a prior history of hypertension, it is not a matter of if her heart will fail. It is simply a matter of when. It is a chemical time bomb. They push the heart rate into extreme tachycardia until the muscle simply gives out and stops beating entirely. I stared at the medical records. The black ink on the white paper was screaming the absolute, undeniable truth. Beatrice did not die of a broken heart. She did not die from the overwhelming stress of a corporate framing. My beautiful wife was systematically and deliberately poisoned. Declan and my children had hired a corrupt, greedy doctor to legally prescribe her a lethal chemical cocktail. They drugged her into a state of terrified dementia, watched her lose her mind in her own home, and then simply waited for the drugs to stop her heart. They murdered her in cold blood right in front of me and disguised it as a natural tragedy. I thanked Marcus, my voice sounding like it belonged to a dead man. I gathered the medical files, shoved them back into the manila envelope, and walked out of the pharmacy. The autumn air felt freezing against my skin, but the fire inside my chest was burning so hot I thought it might consume me entirely. I had the forged power of attorney documents. I had the offshore bank routing numbers from the flash drive, and now I had the medical proof of premeditated murder. I had everything I needed to destroy my enemies completely. I walked down the concrete sidewalk toward my parked truck, my mind racing through the next steps of my strategy. I needed to get this evidence to the federal authorities. I needed to bypass the local police entirely and go straight to the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. I needed to move fast before Friday, before Declan could file the conservatorship petition and lock me away in a padded cell. I reached into my pocket for my truck keys, glancing casually across the busy street, and then I stopped dead in my tracks. Parked exactly half a block down, idling silently near a rusted fire hydrant, was a sleek black luxury SUV. The windows were heavily tinted, completely blacked out to hide the driver, but I recognized the custom chrome grille. I recognized the expensive oversized tires. It was Declan's vehicle. He was not at his corporate office. He had not gone to work. He had followed me. My blood ran absolutely cold. Declan was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He had tracked me to the pharmacy. He was monitoring my movements to see if the old man was really just taking a walk in the park. If he realized who I was visiting, if he suspected for a single second that I was gathering hard evidence against him, he would not wait until Friday to execute his final plan. He had already proven he was willing to kill to protect his stolen millions. I tightened my grip on the manila envelope, keeping my face perfectly neutral, completely hiding the terror and the rage surging through my veins. I unlocked my truck door, knowing that my margin for error had just dropped to zero. I was in the crosshairs, and I had to spring the trap before the hunter realized the prey was holding the gun. I gripped the steering wheel of my old Ford truck until my knuckles turned completely white. Across the street, parked near the rusted fire hydrant, was Declan in his sleek black SUV. The tinted windows hid his face, but I knew he was in there watching my every move. He thought he was hunting a broken old man. He thought I was just a confused widower picking up grief medication. I forced myself to breathe evenly. 40 years of operating heavy machinery at the shipyard had taught me how to control my panic. When a 50-ton load swings in the wind, you do not scream. You lock your hands and you guide the steel exactly where it needs to go. I started the engine and pulled out onto the busy avenue, making sure to keep my speed exactly at the limit. I did not speed up. I did not look in my rearview mirror. I drove like an old man lost in his own sorrow. I took a slow right turn down a narrow residential street, then another right, then a left into a crowded supermarket parking lot. I drove down the aisles past the shopping carts and the families loading groceries. I slipped out the back exit of the parking lot, which connected to a narrow service alley. I pushed the accelerator down, and the heavy V8 engine roared to life. I took 3 more aggressive turns, winding through the industrial district until I was absolutely certain the sleek black SUV was nowhere behind me. I had lost him, but I knew the clock was ticking faster now. The gray autumn clouds hung low and heavy over the highway, threatening a downpour that never quite materialized. I merged onto the interstate, heading out of the city limits. My destination was a small roadside diner about 40 miles north of the city. It was a place where truck drivers and shift workers stopped for bitter coffee and greasy food. It was exactly the kind of place a polished corporate shark like Declan Croft would never set foot in. I was meeting Victor Thorne. Victor was the owner of the massive logistics company where Beatrice had worked for 2 decades. Victor was a hard man. He had built his shipping empire from a single cargo truck into a regional powerhouse. He was demanding and ruthless in business, but he had always respected Beatrice. She was his lead accountant, his financial anchor. When the $1.5 million vanished from his corporate accounts, Victor had been furious. Declan had planted a brilliant trail of fake invoices and digital breadcrumbs that led directly to Beatrice. The corporate auditors had bought the lie completely, but I knew Victor. I knew that deep down he never truly believed Beatrice was capable of such a massive betrayal. Last night, after I found the flash drive in the cedar sewing kit, I had called him. I told him I had the absolute proof of who stole his money and who killed my wife. He did not ask any questions over the phone. He simply told me to name a place far away from the city. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the diner. The neon sign buzzed and flickered against the gloomy afternoon sky. I grabbed the thick manila envelope containing the medical records and the black flash drive and walked inside. The diner smelled like stale cigarette smoke and fried bacon. The waitress behind the counter did not even look up as I walked past the empty vinyl booths. Sitting in the very back corner booth farthest away from the windows was Victor Thorne. He wore a heavy wool suit that looked entirely out of place in the greasy diner. Beside him sat a much younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and a deeply serious expression. The young man had a silver laptop open on the scratched laminate table. I slid into the booth opposite them. The worn vinyl creaked under my weight. Calvin Victor said, his voice rough and low like grinding stones. "I am deeply sorry about Beatrice. She was the most honest woman I ever employed. I never wanted to believe she took that money." "She did not take a single dime, Victor," we replied, setting the envelope and the flash drive onto the table. "My son-in-law Declan Croft framed her. He used her home network access. He created the phantom vendors. And when she figured it out and gathered the proof, he had her medically poisoned by a corrupt doctor so no one would believe a word she said. They murdered her, Victor." Victor stared at me, his gray eyes hardening into absolute pure ice. He looked at the flash drive and then nodded to the young man sitting beside him. "Calvin, this is Arthur. He is the top forensic accountant for my company. There is not a single digital transaction on this earth that Arthur cannot track down and expose. Let us see what your wife found." Arthur took the flash drive and inserted it into his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed. For 20 minutes, no one at the table spoke a single word. The only sound was the clattering of the diner kitchen in the background and the rapid clicking of the keys. I watched Arthur face as he navigated the hidden files Beatrice had meticulously compiled. I saw his eyes widen behind his glasses. I saw him shake his head in quiet disbelief at the sheer audacity of the theft. "Mr. Hughes," Arthur finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "your wife was an absolute genius. She mapped out the entire routing structure. Declan Croft created 4 different shell companies using variations of legitimate vendor names. He submitted falsified shipping invoices for heavy machinery transport that never actually occurred. He funneled exactly $1.5 million out of Mr. Thorne Company over a period of 7 months. Victor clenched his large hands into fists, resting them heavily on the table. "Where is my money, Arthur? Where did that piece of garbage hide it?" Arthur typed a few more commands, bringing up a complex web of banking transfers on his screen. He moved it through 3 different domestic holding accounts to wash the trail, Arthur explained. But Beatrice managed to catch the final destination routing numbers before she was locked out of the system. The $1.5 million is currently sitting in a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I leaned forward, feeling the cold dread returning to my stomach. "Check the personal retirement accounts, Arthur. Check the joint portfolio under my name and Beatrice's name. Arthur opened another window and ran a trace using the account numbers Beatrice had saved. He went completely silent for a moment. He swallowed hard before looking back up at me. Mr. Hughes, I am so sorry. There have been systematic unauthorized withdrawals from your joint retirement accounts. $200,000 has been drained over the past 6 months. It was moved using a digitally verified power of attorney. That money was funneled directly into the exact same Cayman Islands account as the stolen corporate funds. Declan had combined his thefts. He took Victor's shipping money and my life savings and pooled them into one massive offshore vault. The sheer arrogant greed of the man was staggering. He had bought his way into my family, married my daughter, and systematically dismantled our entire lives for a payout. Whose names are on that Cayman account? Victor demanded, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. Arthur clicked his mouse, pulling up the registry data Beatrice had somehow managed to scrape from the banking server. The primary account holder is Declan Croft, Arthur said. But there is a secondary authorized user listed. It is your daughter, Mr. Hughes. Chloe Croft is listed as a full legal co-owner of the offshore trust. My heart shattered all over again. Chloe was not just turning a blind eye to the theft, she was a fully authorized partner in the crime. My own flesh and blood was named on the account holding the money stolen from her dying mother. But there is something else here, Arthur said, leaning closer to his screen and adjusting his glasses. This offshore account is not static. It is actively programmed for a massive international wire transfer. Declan has initiated a sweeping protocol. Next Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the entire balance of the Cayman account is scheduled to be automatically wired to a holding bank in a non-extradition country in South America. Victor cursed under his breath. If that money moves to South America, it is gone forever. The federal authorities will never be able to touch it. They are going to take the cash and vanish. They are running, I said, my voice sounding completely hollow. They know I am starting to ask questions. They know Beatrice left something behind. They are going to skip the country next Monday and leave me rotting in a psychiatric ward. Arthur was still staring at the screen, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Wait, he muttered. There is a secondary trigger attached to this transfer protocol. It is an escrow command linked to a pending real estate liquidation. Explain that in plain English, Arthur Victor commanded. Arthur looked up, his face pale. Declan has set up a massive pending deposit. He has a pre-approved cash buyer lined up for a residential property. The property is your home, Mr. Hughes. Your house is valued at approximately $800,000. Declan has the sale completely brokered and ready to close. But the bank requires one final piece of documentation to release the funds directly into the Cayman account before it sweeps to South America. What document? I asked, my chest feeling like it was bound in iron chains. Arthur turned the laptop screen toward me. It requires a signed estate release form from the primary property owner. It requires your physical signature, Mr. Hughes. If Declan gets your signature on that release form, the house is instantly sold to the cash buyer and the $800,000 immediately dumps into the offshore fund just in time for the Monday morning escape. The trap was finally fully visible. It was a masterpiece of absolute evil. The conservatorship petition I had found on the flash drive, the one Declan had to file by this Friday, was the final key. If the corrupt judge declared me mentally incompetent on Friday, Declan would gain full legal guardianship over me. As my legal guardian, he would have the absolute power to sign that estate release form on my behalf. He would force me into a memory care facility on Friday afternoon, sign the papers. Friday night, liquidate my house over the weekend and fly out of the country with over $2.5 million by Monday morning. I was completely out of time. I had exactly 4 days to dismantle a conspiracy that had been secretly building for years. I looked at Victor Thorne. The wealthy business owner looked back at me, his gray eyes burning with the exact same cold, unyielding fury that was coursing through my own veins. We did not need to speak. We both knew that the police would be too slow. We both knew that corporate lawyers would take months to file injunctions. We had to break them ourselves. We had to build a wall of pure iron and let Declan Croft drive his sleek black SUV straight into it at 100 miles an hour. Print every single page, Arthur, I said, my voice steady and hard. Print the offshore routing numbers. Print the real estate contracts. Print the forged power of attorney. I am going back to the city. I am going to let my son-in-law think he has won. I am going to let him smile and drink my bourbon right up until the second I drop the steel. Arthur nodded silently and connected a portable printer to his laptop. The machine began to hum, spitting out page after page of undeniable, condemning truth. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, stacking them carefully into my manila envelope. The rain outside the diner finally began to fall, coming down in heavy, violent sheets against the glass windows. I did not feel the cold. I did not feel the age in my bones. I was a father who had been pushed past the absolute limits of human endurance. They had murdered my wife. They had stolen my life savings. They had corrupted my children. And now they were coming for my home. Friday was the deadline. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Victor Thorne and I drove back into the city limits under a sky the color of bruised iron. I sat in the passenger seat of his luxury sedan, gripping the thick manila envelope with both hands. Inside that folder was the destruction of Declan Croft. It contained the offshore routing numbers, the forged power of attorney, and the toxic prescription logs proving they murdered my beautiful Beatrice. Victor drove in absolute silence, his jaw set tight. We were not going to the local police precinct to waste time with desk sergeants who might just see a confused, grieving widower. We were heading straight to the federal building downtown. We were taking this conspiracy directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I looked out the window, my mind working with mechanical precision. I thought about Beatrice sitting at her desk, meticulously tracking phantom vendors and digital wire transfers. She built the perfect trap for her killer. Now it was my job to drop the steel. The federal building was a massive monolith of concrete and glass rising high above the city skyline. It looked like an impenetrable fortress. That was exactly what I wanted to lock my son-in-law inside for the rest of his natural life. We walked through the heavy revolving doors and past strict security checkpoints. Victor used his corporate influence to secure an immediate emergency meeting with the head of the Financial Crimes Division. A stern agent checked our identification badges and escorted us to a secure elevator. We rode to the 14th floor in absolute silence, watching the digital numbers climb. We were led down a brightly lit corridor into a stark, windowless conference room. I sat at the long metal table, placing the manila envelope directly in front of me, keeping my hands still. I felt like a machine built for one single purpose. A few minutes later, Special Agent Thomas Vance walked into the room, accompanied by a female agent named Sarah Miller. Vance was a tall, broad-shouldered man with thinning gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen the worst of human nature. Agent Miller carried a yellow notepad and looked equally serious, her posture rigid and professional. Vance did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy about my recent loss. He shook Victor's hand, and then he shook mine. His grip was solid and calloused. He sat down at the head of the metal table and folded his hands deliberately. "Victor told me you have something that requires immediate federal intervention, Calvin," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "He said you uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud operating right under our noses. Tell me exactly what we are dealing with here." I opened the manila envelope and spread the documents across the cold metal table. I started with the corporate theft that set this nightmare in motion. I showed them the fake vendor invoices and digital routing numbers Declan used to siphon $1.5 million out of Victor Logistics Company. I explained exactly how Declan used Beatrice's home network access to frame her for the embezzlement. Then I showed them the personal financial records. I laid out the retirement portfolio statements proving Declan quietly drained $200,000 of my life savings over the past 6 months. I placed the forged durable power of attorney right in the center of the table. I pointed out Beatrice's shaky, uncertain signature and Chloe's bold signature acting as the legal witness. Finally, I laid down the pharmacy logs and medical records. I explained how Dr. Sterling prescribed Beatrice lethal, highly restricted antipsychotics to deliberately mimic severe rapid-onset dementia and stop her healthy heart. Agent Vance and Agent Miller stared at the documents for a long time. The silence in the interrogation room was incredibly heavy. Vance picked up the offshore banking records that Beatrice had brilliantly traced before her death. He looked closely at the Cayman Islands routing numbers tracing the flow of money. He looked at the forged signatures on the power of attorney. He read the toxic prescription list with a deepening frown, his jaw muscles flexing. When Agent Vance finally looked up, his eyes were wide with genuine shock. He looked at Victor and then directly at me. "Calvin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have worked in the Federal Financial Crimes Unit for over 20 years. I have tracked international money launderers and ruthless corporate embezzlers across the globe. But I have never seen a paper trail this meticulously documented by a civilian. Your wife was an absolute genius. She mapped out a massive wire fraud conspiracy with terrifying precision. And the medical records elevate this to a premeditated federal homicide investigation." Agent Miller reviewed the documents with absolute sheer disgust. "Declan and Chloe constructed a classic predatory elder abuse trap," she told me. They were using the false dementia narrative to strip me of my legal rights. The estate release forms they needed me to sign on Friday would instantly liquidate my $800,000 home and route the cash directly offshore. They are planning to flee the country next Monday morning, Agent Miller explained, tapping the transfer protocol document. They have flights, passports, and hidden accounts ready. But we have a major legal problem, Calvin. While this physical evidence is staggering, a defense attorney will argue the corporate theft was entirely your wife doing. They will argue the lethal prescriptions were simply a tragic malpractice error by Dr. Sterling. They will claim the power of attorney was signed willingly. In federal court, physical documents can easily be twisted to create reasonable doubt. We need something bulletproof to secure a conviction before they move the money. We need a concrete, undeniable verbal confession of intent. We need Declan to admit on tape he knows exactly what he is doing to you. Agent Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and looking me right in the eye. We are setting up a federal sting operation, Calvin, but we need your complete cooperation to make this work. We need to wire you with a hidden microphone and send you back into the lion den. You are going to go back to your house tonight. You are going to look the man who murdered your wife in the eye and let him talk. We need him to explicitly demand your signature on those estate release forms out loud. We need him to reference the offshore accounts or the fake dementia narrative so the microphone picks it up clearly. If we get his malicious intent to defraud you on a federal audio recording, we can lock him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. I looked at the two federal agents. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I told them to wire me up immediately. I told them I would do whatever it took to bring the crushing steel down on Declan Croft. Agent Miller returned carrying a small black recording device and a roll of clear tape. It was no bigger than a matchbook. She taped the device securely to my chest, right over my heart, using strong medical adhesive. She carefully hid the tiny microphone wire beneath the collar of my shirt, ensuring it was completely invisible. The device felt incredibly heavy and ice cold against my skin. It felt exactly like a loaded weapon. As she finished adjusting the tape, Agent Vance stepped closer to make sure I understood the extreme gravity of what I was about to do. Calvin, you need to listen to me very carefully right now, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Declan is a highly intelligent, cornered animal. He has already murdered your wife in cold blood to protect this conspiracy. He has already proven he has absolutely zero moral boundaries. If he suspects for even one fraction of a second that you know the truth, or that you are wearing a wire, he will resort to extreme physical violence. He will not hesitate to kill you right there in your own living room. You must play the role of the broken, compliant, and confused old man flawlessly. I looked Agent Vance dead in the eye without blinking. I thought about the 40 grueling years I spent operating heavy machinery at the Eastern Seaboard shipyard. I thought about the massive iron beams swaying unpredictably in the freezing winter rain. I know exactly how to lock my muscles, Agent Vance, I told him, my voice steady, hard, and unwavering. I know exactly how to play the confused, broken fool. I will give you the exact verbal confession you need to put him away forever. Victor Thorne stood up and placed a heavy, comforting hand on my broad shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. Agent Miller explained they would be parked in a dark, unmarked surveillance van at the end of my street. They would be listening to every single word through the live audio feed, transmitting directly from my chest. If things went terribly wrong, if Declan made a sudden threatening move or tried to physically force me to sign the documents, they would breach the front door in less than 30 seconds with weapons drawn. I gathered my heavy wool coat and prepared to head back into the nightmare waiting for me at home. I left the federal building and got back into my old Ford truck. The drive back to my house felt like an absolute eternity. The sky was growing darker as late afternoon bled into early evening. My heart beat in a steady, rhythmic thud against the hidden recording device taped to my chest. I rehearsed my lines over and over in my head. I practiced the slight, pathetic tremble in my voice that would convince him I was weak. I practiced the stooped, defeated posture they expected to see when I walked through the door. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was an active federal informant executing a highly dangerous sting operation inside my own home. I pulled into my quiet neighborhood and drove slowly down my familiar street. I did not look for the unmarked surveillance van. I pulled into my concrete driveway. Declan's sleek black SUV was parked aggressively in the driveway, blocking the path to the garage. The ruthless hunter was home waiting for me in the dark. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet, dark cab for a long, agonizing moment. I took a deep, shuddering breath of the cold autumn air, gathering every ounce of strength I had built over a lifetime of physical labor. I stepped out of the truck and walked slowly up the cracked concrete path to the front porch. I dragged my heavy work boots against the cement to mimic the shuffle of an exhausted old man. I unlocked the heavy wooden door, hearing the tumblers click, and pushed it open. The house was completely silent, suffocating, and still. It smelled cold, sterile, and incredibly dangerous. I shuffled down the long hallway, letting my broad shoulders slump heavily forward under an invisible, crushing weight. I rounded the corner into the living room, keeping my eyes cast downward. Declan was not hiding in the shadows. He was sitting perfectly still in my worn brown leather recliner. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing his expensive silver watch. On the coffee table right in front of him sat a massive, intimidating stack of thick legal papers. A heavy silver luxury pen rested perfectly parallel to the documents. He did not offer a fake, sympathetic smile this time. He did not pretend to care about my grief. He looked up at me, and his eyes were entirely black and dead. He stared at me with the cold, ruthless calculation of an executioner who had finally grown tired of waiting. The rain slammed against the living room windows in heavy, punishing sheets. I sat alone in my worn brown leather recliner, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Beneath my thick flannel shirt, the small black recording device rested cold and hard against my chest. The medical tape pulled tightly at my skin, serving as a constant physical reminder of the federal agents parked in an unmarked van at the end of my street. They were out there in the dark, listening to my steady heartbeat, waiting for the trap to spring. I closed my eyes and focused on slowing my breathing. I thought about the 40 years I spent working down at the Eastern Seaboard shipyard. I remembered what it felt like to sit inside the cramped metal cabin of a massive crane suspended hundreds of feet in the freezing air. When the wind howled off the harbor and the massive iron chains groaned under the weight of 50 tons of raw steel, you learned a very specific kind of patience. You learned that survival depended on absolute control. You did not rush a heavy lift. You waited for the wind to die down, you watched the load stabilize, and you never, ever showed fear. Tonight I was operating the most dangerous lift of my entire life. I was preparing to drop a crushing weight on the people who had murdered my wife. The heavy silence of the house was broken by the sound of footsteps coming down the hallway. I let my shoulders slump forward instantly, letting the years of hard labor show in my posture. I let my chin drop toward my chest, making myself look small and entirely defeated. The living room door swung open. Declan walked in first, followed closely by my daughter Chloe. Jamal trailed behind them, lingering near the doorframe like a frightened child. They positioned themselves around my recliner with the calculated precision of a hunting pack closing in on a wounded animal. Declan stood directly in front of me, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit. He stared down at me with an expression of complete predatory confidence. Chloe sat on the edge of the sofa, leaning forward with her hands clasped tightly together. She arranged her face into a mask of deep, sorrowful concern. Jamal refused to look at me. He stared down at the hardwood floor, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. "Dad." Chloe began, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sympathy. "We need to have a very difficult conversation with you tonight. We love you so much, and we are just so incredibly worried about your safety." I blinked up at her, slowly letting my hands shake as they rested on the armrests of the recliner. "What is wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, making my voice sound thin and confused. "Is something the matter with the estate arrangements?" Declan let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Calvin, this is not about the estate. This is about you. Your health is failing rapidly, and we cannot pretend everything is fine anymore. You are becoming a serious danger to yourself and to this household." I widened my eyes, trying to look genuinely frightened by his aggressive tone. "I am fine, Declan," I muttered, shrinking back into the leather cushions. "I am just tired from grieving. It has only been a few days since we buried Beatrice. A man is allowed to be tired." Chloe shook her head, reaching out to place her smooth, manicured hand over my rough, calloused fingers. "Dad, it is more than just being tired. You are losing your memory. You are doing things that do not make any sense. Do you not remember what happened yesterday afternoon?" I stared at her blankly. "What happened yesterday?" "You left the gas stove running on high for 3 hours," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "I came down to the kitchen and the entire house smelled like gas. You were just sitting at the table, staring at the wall, completely unresponsive. You could have blown the entire house up, Dad. You could have killed us all." The sheer audacity of the lie almost made me break character. Beatrice had replaced that old gas stove with a modern electric induction cooktop 3 years ago. There was no gas line in the kitchen. But Chloe did not care about the truth. She was building a psychological cage around me, brick by fake brick, trying to gaslight me into believing my own mind was rotting away. I swallowed the burning rage that rose in my throat. I forced my hands to tremble violently beneath hers. "I do not remember that, Chloe," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I swear to you, I do not remember leaving any stove on." Declan stepped closer, casting a long, dark shadow over my chair. "That is exactly the point, Calvin. You do not remember. You are suffering from severe cognitive decline. 2 nights ago, I found you wandering the neighborhood in the freezing rain in your pajamas. You were calling out for Beatrice like she was still alive. I had to physically guide you back into the house. It is breaking our hearts to watch you lose your mind like this." Another brilliant fabrication. They were laying the groundwork for the exact symptoms Dr. Sterling had listed in his fraudulent medical report. They were rehearsing the lies they planned to tell the judge tomorrow. I turned my head slowly and looked at Jamal, my quiet youngest son, the boy I had worked double shifts to send to college, the boy who was currently hiding $50,000 of blood money in his checking account. "Jamal," I said, my voice pathetic and desperate. "You are a good boy, Jamal. Tell me the truth. Am I really doing these things? Am I really losing my mind?" Jamal flinched. He finally lifted his head and met my eyes. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine shame flicker across his face. I saw the ghost of the boy he used to be struggling against the monster he had become. But then I saw him remember the sleek slate-gray sports car parked outside. I saw him remember the offshore money. He swallowed hard, burying his conscience deep down where it could never bother him again. "Yes, Dad," Jamal said, his voice tight but steady. "You have been acting really crazy lately. You do not make any sense anymore. We are all just trying to help you." The physical pain in my chest at that exact moment was not an act. Hearing my own son sell my soul for a piece of machinery broke something fundamental inside me. It severed the very last cord of paternal love I held for the people in this room. The tears that began to slide down my weathered cheeks were completely real. I was not crying because I was a confused old man. I was weeping for the absolute death of my family. I was mourning the fact that my children were dead to me, that they had traded their humanity for stolen wealth. I let the tears fall freely, feeling them track hot and heavy over my wrinkles. I bowed my head, covering my face with my shaking hands. I let out a long, agonizing sob. I let my broad shoulders collapse inward entirely, surrendering to the physical performance of a broken, defeated father. I channeled every ounce of pain and blue-collar endurance I had cultivated over a lifetime of hardship. "I am just so lost without her," I cried, my voice muffled by my rough hands. "I do not know what is real anymore. If you say I left the stove on, then I must have left it on. I do not want to be a burden to any of you. I do not want to burn the house down. I am just a useless old man." Chloe patted my knee, her voice dripping with triumphant satisfaction. "Oh, Dad, do not say that. You are not useless, you are just sick. But Declan and I have a plan to make sure you are taken care of. We have found a beautiful, comfortable place where professionals can look after you round the clock." Declan stepped right up to the edge of the recliner, holding the massive stack of legal documents I had seen earlier. He held the heavy silver pen in his right hand, offering it to me like a lifeline. "Calvin, we just need you to sign these estate transfer documents. It gives me the legal authority to handle the medical bills and the house transition, so you do not have to stress your sick brain over the details anymore. Once you sign these, we can get you the professional help you desperately need." I kept my head bowed, peering through the gaps in my fingers. I could see the greed radiating off Declan like heat from an engine. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He needed my signature to instantly liquidate my home and dump the $800,000 into the Cayman Islands account before Monday morning. I took another shuddering breath, dragging out the moment, building the tension until the room felt ready to snap. "I am so tired, Declan," I whispered, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "My eyes are so blurry I cannot even read the words on those papers tonight. My hands are shaking too much to hold the pen. Let an old man rest for one more night. I promise you I will sign whatever you need tomorrow morning. Give me until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning and I will sign the house over to you. I just need to sleep." Declan's jaw tightened with visible frustration. He wanted the signature right now. He wanted the victory sealed. But he looked at my pathetic weeping form and his arrogance won out over his caution. He believed he had completely shattered my spirit. He believed the old crane operator was entirely docile and broken. He lowered the pen and offered me a magnanimous, condescending smile. "Of course, Calvin," Declan said, his voice smooth as glass. "We can wait until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Get some rest. You are doing the right thing for everyone." He gestured to Chloe and Jamal. They turned and walked out of the living room, leaving me sitting alone in the dark. I leaned back against the leather cushions and closed my eyes. I let my breathing become deep, loud, and perfectly rhythmic. I forced the muscles in my face to go completely slack, mimicking the heavy, exhausted sleep of an old man who had finally given up the fight. But beneath my flannel shirt, my heart was hammering against the medical tape holding the FBI microphone to my chest. I kept my eyes shut, listening intently to the sounds of the house. I heard Chloe and Jamal walk up the wooden stairs heading toward their bedrooms, but I did not hear Declan follow them. I heard the faint, soft tread of his expensive leather shoes moving down the hallway just outside the living room door. He had stopped near the antique grandfather clock. The house was dead quiet. The rain outside had temporarily stopped, leaving only the heavy silence of the autumn night. Declan had gotten sloppy in his overwhelming triumph. He thought I was deeply asleep in the recliner just 10 feet away. He thought he was completely invincible. I heard the faint electronic beep of a cellular phone unlocking. I heard him dial a number and wait for the connection. I held my breath, locking every muscle in my body into absolute rigid stillness. Gordon Declan said, his voice low and vibrating with arrogant excitement. "Yeah, it is me. Sorry to call so late, but I have excellent news." He paused, listening to the man on the other end of the line. The man I knew was Dr. Sterling. No, there were absolutely no complications. Declan continued, speaking freely into the quiet hallway. The old man broke completely tonight. We ran the dementia routine on him, and he collapsed like a house of cards. He actually sat there and cried in his chair. It was pathetic. He completely surrendered. Another short pause. I could hear Declan shifting his weight on the hardwood floor. "I am getting his physical signature on the estate release forms tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock. Declan said, his voice echoing perfectly toward the living room door. "Once he signs, the liquid capital transfers instantly into the Cayman account. Your medical evaluation holding him incompetent will not even be challenged. He is going straight to the memory care ward right after he signs the papers." I felt the cold, hard plastic of the recording device pressed against my skin, capturing every single syllable of the conversation. Declan was handing the federal agents the exact irrefutable proof they demanded. "We are done here, Gordon." Declan finalized, his tone turning sharp and commanding. "The job is complete. The old man is finished. Wire your final payment by noon tomorrow. I will see you on this golf course." Declan ended the call. I heard him chuckle softly to himself in the dark hallway before he finally turned and walked up the stairs to join his wife. I remained perfectly still in the recliner for another 20 minutes, making absolutely sure the house was completely asleep. The grandfather clock ticked loudly, marking the passage of time. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Declan planned to take my house, my money, and my freedom. He planned to lock me away and disappear with the blood money he stole from my murdered wife. I slowly opened my eyes in the dark living room. The tears were gone. The act was over. I reached up and pressed my hand firmly against the hidden wire on my chest, sealing the ironclad federal trap. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Declan Croft was going to learn exactly what happens when you drop a 50-ton weight on your own head. Friday morning arrived exactly the way a funeral does. It was cold, heavy, and entirely inevitable. I was sitting at the solid oak dining room table long before the sun even tried to break through the thick gray clouds. This was the same table where Beatrice and I had shared thousands of warm meals. It was the same table where we had celebrated Chloe getting accepted into college and Jamal scoring his first Little League home run. I ran my rough, calloused hands over the worn wood, feeling the deep scratches and the rich history embedded in the grain. I had built this quiet, beautiful life with my bare hands. I had spent 40 years lifting 50-ton steel beams at the shipyard day after day in the freezing rain and the blistering heat. I had bled for this family. I had broken my back to give my children everything they ever wanted, so they would never have to struggle the way I did. And now they were waking up in the bedrooms I had painted for them, preparing to walk down the stairs and steal the very last pieces of my soul. Beneath my thick wool sweater, the hidden recording device was taped tightly to my chest. The medical adhesive pulled at my skin with every single breath I took. I could feel the tiny microphone wire resting perfectly flat against my collarbone. Outside, parked down the street in the gloomy morning mist, the federal agents were sitting in their unmarked van. They were listening. They were waiting for the signal. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, letting my heart rate slow to a steady mechanical rhythm. I was no longer just a grieving widower. I was a man operating the most dangerous lift of his entire life. At exactly 10 o'clock, the silence of the house was broken by the sound of heavy, confident footsteps coming down the hallway. Declan walked into the dining room first. He was wearing a flawless navy blue custom suit and a smug, victorious expression that made my stomach turn. Behind him walked Chloe and Jamal. Chloe had dressed in dark, muted colors, wiping away non-existent tears to play the role of the heartbroken daughter. Jamal simply stared at the floorboards, unable to look me in the eye. Bringing up the rear was a fourth man I had never seen before. He was a thin, nervous-looking man clutching a scuffed leather briefcase. His eyes darted around the room like a rat trapped in an alleyway. This was the corrupt notary, the final piece of Declan Trap. The man who had been paid to put his official government stamp on the theft of my home and the complete destruction of my independence. Declan stepped up to the head of the table and placed a massive stack of thick legal documents directly in front of me. He pulled out a heavy silver pen and set it down with a sharp metallic click. He looked down at me and his voice was sickeningly sweet. It was the tone of a predator trying to soothe a wounded animal right before snapping its neck. "Good morning, Calvin," Declan said, resting his hands flat on the table. "I know this is a very difficult day for you. We all know how much you are hurting right now, but we are doing this because we love you. We are doing this to secure your care and make sure you are safe." Chloe pulled out a chair and sat down right beside me. She reached out and placed her soft hand over my calloused wrist. "Oh, Dad," she murmured, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sympathy. "It breaks my heart to see you struggling so much with your memory. You are just not yourself anymore. But Declan has found the most wonderful facility for you. Golden Meadows is beautiful. You will have doctors checking on you every single day, and you will never have to worry about leaving the stove on or getting lost in the neighborhood ever again." I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders slump forward. I let my hands shake exactly the way they expected them to. "Is this really necessary?" I asked, making my voice sound thin, frail, and completely defeated. "Can I not just stay here in my own house? I promise I will not be a burden to anyone." Declan sighed heavily, shaking his head with an expression of deep fake pity. "Calvin, we have been over this. You are in severe cognitive decline. You cannot take care of yourself or this property anymore. These documents are just a simple formality. It is an estate transfer and a full power of attorney release. Once you sign these papers, I will take over the massive burden of managing the finances. I will handle the sale of the house and use the funds to guarantee your medical care at the facility. You do not have to stress your sick brain over the details anymore. You just need to sign your name on the dotted lines and we can finally go get you the help you need." The corrupt notary opened his briefcase and pulled out his official ink stamp. He set it on the table, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to validate the absolute worst betrayal I had ever witnessed. Jamal shifted his weight in the corner, crossing his arms over his chest and staring intensely at the wall. He knew exactly what these papers meant. He knew they were sending his own father to rot in a padded cell so he could collect his share of the offshore money, and he was doing absolutely nothing to stop it. I looked down at the documents. The bold black letters at the top read, "Irrevocable power of attorney and estate liquidation release." The trap was fully set. The cage door was standing wide open, waiting for me to step inside. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy silver pen. I let the metal barrel rest awkwardly between my fingers. I hovered the tip of the pen just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. The entire room went completely breathless. I could feel Declan staring at the pen, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. I could hear Chloe holding her breath beside me. They thought they had won. They thought the broken old man had completely surrendered. I held the pen there for 5 agonizing seconds, and then I stopped. I did not sign the paper. I slowly lowered the silver pen and set it down quietly on the solid oak table. The faint click of the metal hitting the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent dining room. I took a very slow, very deep breath, and then the frail, confused old man vanished entirely. I uncurled my spine and sat up perfectly straight. I rolled my broad shoulders back, letting my chest expand. The manufactured trembling in my hands stopped instantly. I looked up from the table and locked my eyes directly onto Declan. The forced confusion was gone from my face. My eyes turned into cold, unyielding steel. Declan's arrogant smile faltered. His brow furrowed in sudden confusion. "Calvin, what are you doing?" He snapped, his voice losing its sweet syrup and turning sharp. "Pick up the pen and sign the papers. The notary is waiting." I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I reached down beneath my chair and pulled up a thick, unmarked manila folder I had hidden there before dawn. I placed it onto the dining room table right on top of his fraudulent legal documents. "I am not signing anything, Declan," I said. My voice was no longer thin and reedy. It was a deep, heavy rumble born from 40 years of shouting over industrial machinery. It was the voice of a father who had finally had enough. Chloe snatched her hand away from my arm, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad, what is going on?" She stammered, her fake sympathy completely evaporating. "What is in that folder?" I flipped the manila folder open. I reached inside and pulled out the first stack of papers. I slid them slowly across the polished oak wood until they rested right in front of Declan. "That is the forensic accounting trace of your hidden accounts," I said, my voice echoing off the dining room walls. "That is the complete routing history showing exactly how you created phantom vendors to embezzle $1.5 million from Victor Thorne Logistics Company. That is the digital proof of how you drained $200,000 from my personal retirement funds. And that is the exact account number of the offshore Cayman Islands Trust, where you pooled all the stolen money." Declan's face turned the color of dirty ash. The confident corporate shark looked like he had just been struck by lightning. He stared at the banking numbers, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The corrupt notary took 2 huge steps backward away from the table, clutching his briefcase to his chest. I reached into the folder again and pulled out the second stack of documents. I slid them across the table, stopping them right next to the banking records. "Those are the prescription logs from Dr. Sterling." I continued, my tone absolutely merciless. "Those are the highly restricted antipsychotic medications you paid him to prescribe to Beatrice. You deliberately poisoned my wife. You drugged her to mimic severe dementia so no one would believe her when she found the missing money. And those are the autopsy reports proving exactly how those drugs forced her heart into fatal tachycardia." Jamal let out a loud, suffocated gasp from the corner of the room. He stumbled backward, hitting the wall and sliding down until he was crouching on the floor, holding his head in his hands. Chloe let out a piercing, horrified scream. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers off the table to rip them apart. I slammed my heavy, calloused hand down onto the documents, pinning them to the wood with a force that made the entire table shudder. "Do not touch them, Chloe," I roared, my voice carrying the absolute fury of a grieving husband. "Your signature is on the forged power of attorney. Your name is listed as the co-owner of the Cayman account. You helped him murder your own mother for a payout." Declan stared at the mountain of irrefutable evidence. His perfect plan had just been entirely incinerated right in front of his eyes. The mask of the sophisticated, wealthy businessman shattered into a million jagged pieces. The raw, desperate animal hiding beneath it finally clawed its way to the surface. "You forgot one thing, Declan," I said, leaning forward, keeping my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face. "You thought I was just some stupid, broken old man you could push into a corner? But a crane operator always checks the rigging before he lifts the load. I checked yours, and I found every single dirty, rotten wire you tried to hide." Declan lost his mind completely. A primal, guttural sound tore from his throat. He lunged across the dining room table, scattering the fake estate documents into the air. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the collar of my wool sweater, violently yanking me forward. I did not flinch. I did not fight back. I sat there perfectly still, feeling the hard plastic of the FBI recording device pressing against my chest as he pulled me upward. He leaned his face in so close to mine I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His eyes were wide, wild, and completely unhinged. "It does not matter what you know, you stupid old fool," Declan snarled, his voice vibrating with pure malicious intent. "I will rip these papers up right now. I will drag you to that facility myself. I will drug you until you cannot even remember your own name. Nobody is going to believe a crazy old man. You are completely finished, Calvin. I am taking everything." The physical proximity of the man was suffocating. Declan's face was inches from mine. I could see the fine sheen of sweat beading on his forehead and the frantic, uncontrolled twitch of a muscle near his left eye. He was a man watching his meticulously constructed empire crumble into dust, and he believed that sheer brute violence could somehow force the pieces back together. His hands gripped the thick wool of my sweater, twisting the fabric so aggressively that his knuckles ground directly into my collarbone. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps that smelled faintly of bitter coffee and pure, unadulterated panic. I did not struggle against his grip. I did not raise my calloused hands to defend myself. 40 years on the loading docks and in the cabs of massive industrial cranes had taught me one fundamental truth. When a 50-ton steel beam begins to swing out of control, you do not fight the momentum. You step out of its path and let gravity do the punishing work. Declan thought he had me physically pinned. He thought his sudden explosive intimidation would force me back into the pathetic, confused box he had built for me. But I was not looking at a terrifying corporate predator anymore. I was looking at a dead man, walking. I kept my eyes locked onto his, holding his panicked, wild gaze with absolute icy stillness. The room around us had fallen completely silent, save for the harsh, grating sound of Declan breathing and the quiet, pathetic weeping of my youngest son, Jamal, crouched in the corner. Chloe remained frozen in her chair, staring at the mountain of irrefutable evidence spread across the dining room table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The corrupt notary was pressing his thin frame flat against the far wall, desperately wishing he could turn invisible. "You are nothing but a crazy, broken old man," Declan hissed, small drops of spittle flying from his lips and hitting my weathered cheek. "I am going to rip these papers to shreds. I am going to drag you out of this house by your hair if I have to. Nobody is going to believe you. Nobody is coming to save you." I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I had worn since the day my beautiful Beatrice died. I leaned forward slightly, closing the minimal distance between us, bringing my mouth right up to his ear so he could hear the absolute terrifying certainty in my voice. I did not speak to him. I spoke directly into the collar of my sweater where the tiny, hidden FBI microphone was securely taped against my chest. "He took the bait," I said, my voice a deep, resonant rumble in the quiet room. "Come and get him." For 2 agonizing seconds, Declan just stared at me. His brow furrowed in deep, profound confusion. His vice-like grip on my sweater loosened just a fraction of an inch as his panicked brain struggled to process the words I had just spoken. He looked down at my chest, staring at the thick wool, and then back up at my face. The realization hit him like a physical, crushing blow. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin looking like a wax corpse. His mouth opened to speak, to perhaps formulate one last desperate lie, but he never got the chance. The breach was instantaneous and absolutely deafening. It sounded as though a bomb had detonated directly on my front porch. The solid oak front door, the heavy, secure door I had sanded and stained with my own 2 hands 20 years ago, exploded inward with a catastrophic splintering crunch. The reinforced wood shattered completely off its heavy brass hinges and slammed violently against the hallway wall. A split second later, the heavy glass sliding doors at the back of the dining room shattered into a million glittering pieces as tactical officers smashed through from the rear patio. The quiet, gloomy morning air was suddenly filled with the deafening, overwhelming roar of federal authority. "FBI, nobody move. Show me your hands. Get your hands where I can see them right now." Over a dozen heavily armed federal agents and local police officers flooded into my home like a tidal wave of dark tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and blinding flashlights. The sheer, overwhelming physical force of their entry paralyzed everyone in the room. The air was instantly thick with the smell of splintered wood, shattered glass, and raw adrenaline. Red and blue emergency lights from the cruisers parked outside began to flash wildly through the front windows, painting the dining room walls in harsh, alternating violent colors. Declan released my sweater as if the wool had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward, his hands shooting up into the air in a gesture of pure instinctual surrender. He tried to speak, tried to formulate one of his slick corporate defenses, but the words died completely in his throat. "Get on the ground. Get on the ground. Right now." 2 massive tactical agents hit Declan simultaneously. They did not treat him like a wealthy executive or a sophisticated businessman. They treated him exactly like the dangerous cornered felon he was. They grabbed his arms and drove him hard into the hardwood floor. The violent impact made the antique china cabinet rattle against the wall. Declan hit the ground with a heavy, sickening thud, his expensive custom suit instantly covered in dust and glass shards. An agent pressed a heavy black tactical boot firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him completely flat against the floorboards. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the dining room. It was the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "Do not move a single muscle," a towering agent yelled, pressing his considerable weight down into Declan's back. Across the room, Chloe let out a blood-curdling, hysterical shriek. She leaped up from her dining chair, knocking it over backward with a loud crash. She tried to back away from the table, but 2 female FBI agents were already on her, grabbing her arms and spinning her around with professional, practiced force. Chloe fought against their grip, thrashing wildly and screaming that there had been a massive mistake. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, desperate wail. "I am the victim here. You cannot do this to me. I have not done anything wrong. Get your hands off me." The corrupt notary did not even try to run. He dropped his scuffed leather briefcase, the metal clasps popping open, and sank immediately to his knees. He laced his trembling fingers behind his head and began sobbing openly, pleading for leniency. A local police officer hauled him up roughly by his collar and slammed him against the wall, securing his wrists tightly in thick plastic zip ties. In the corner, Jamal had curled himself into a tight, pathetic ball, pressing his face against his knees and rocking back and forth in pure terror. An agent stood directly over him, aiming a bright flashlight into his face and commanding him to stay down. Jamal was hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, panicked, ragged gasps. Special Agent Thomas Vance walked calmly through the shattered front doorway, stepping over the splintered oak with the casual, measured grace of a man who had commanded 1,000 crime scenes. He was flanked by Agent Sarah Miller, who was already holding a digital camera and rapidly photographing the mountain of irrefutable evidence I had laid out on the dining room table. Agent Vance walked straight up to where Declan was pinned against the floor. He looked down at my son-in-law with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. "Declan Croft," Agent Vance said, his voice cutting through the chaotic shouting of the room like a cold razor blade. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, felony, elder abuse, and the premeditated murder of Beatrice Hughes. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." Declan twisted his head against the dusty hardwood floor, trying desperately to look up at the federal agent. His face was scraped and bleeding slightly from the forceful impact. The arrogant corporate shark was completely gone, replaced entirely by a terrified, cornered rat. He saw the badges, he saw the tactical gear, and he realized in that exact, freezing moment that his entire life was completely over. The offshore accounts, the luxury cars, the million-dollar payouts, it was all gone forever. And the moment he realized he had lost, Declan did exactly what cornered rats always do. He turned violently on his own pack. "It was her!" Declan screamed, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic panic. He nodded his head frantically toward Chloe, who was currently being pushed forcefully against the wall by the 2 female agents. "It was my wife. It was Chloe's idea. She hated her mother. She was the one who found Dr. Sterling. She paid him to write the fake prescriptions. She forged the power of attorney. I just helped her move the money. I was just trying to protect my wife. She manipulated me into doing it." The absolute pure cowardice of the man was staggering. He had murdered my wife in cold blood. He had plotted meticulously to steal my home and lock me in a psychiatric ward. And the very second the cold steel handcuffs went on, he threw the woman he had promised to love directly under the bus, desperately hoping to save his own skin. I stood up from my recliner and looked at the pathetic creature writhing on my floor. I felt nothing but cold, hard, impenetrable contempt. Chloe stopped struggling against the agents. Her mouth fell open in absolute, unadulterated shock. She stared at the man she had married, staring at the man who was currently trying to hand her a life sentence in federal prison just to shave a few years off his own. The shock lasted for about 3 seconds before it melted instantly into a pure, vitriolic rage. "You lying piece of garbage!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing harshly through her throat. She lunged forward, trying to kick at Declan, but the agents held her firmly back. "Do not you dare put this on me. It was your plan. It was always your plan. You set up the shell companies. You opened the Cayman Islands account. You are the one who met with Dr. Sterling in secret to get those lethal pills. I just signed the papers because you told me we would be rich. You said the old man would never figure it out. You said he was too stupid to understand the bank statements." She was crying hysterically now, dark mascara running down her face in thick, ugly black streaks. She looked at Agent Vance, pleading desperately with her wide eyes. "Listen to me," she begged, her voice trembling with rising panic. "He forced me to do it. He controlled everything. He even paid off my brother. Look at Jamal. Ask Jamal." Declan gave Jamal $50,000 in cash to keep his mouth shut and help us push the dementia story. Jamal knew everything. We all knew, but it was Declan's master plan. The betrayal cascaded through the dining room like a violent chain reaction of collapsing dominoes. They were ripping each other apart, tearing down the very family they had already destroyed just to save themselves. I looked over at Jamal, my youngest son, the quiet boy I had taught to fish at the local lake, the boy I had carried on my shoulders when his small legs grew tired. He was kneeling on the floor, completely surrounded by federal agents, weeping so hard his entire body was shaking uncontrollably. When Chloe exposed the $50,000 hush money, Jamal completely broke. The very last remaining shred of his emotional composure evaporated into the cold air. He ignored the federal agent standing firmly over him and began to crawl across the hardwood floor toward my recliner. He dragged himself on his hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining sense of pride or dignity. He stopped right at my feet and grabbed the cuffs of my denim jeans, burying his tear-soaked face directly against my heavy work boots. "Dad," Jamal sobbed, his voice thick and choked with absolute suffocating misery. "Dad, please, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I did not want to do it. I swear to God I did not want to do it. But Declan said you were going to lose the house anyway. He said the money would change my life. I was just so stupid. Please, Dad, please tell them I am a good person. Please do not let them take me to prison. I cannot go to prison, Dad. Please save me." He clung to my legs, begging and pleading with the father he had just spent the last 3 days actively trying to destroy. He wanted me to save him from the severe consequences of his own boundless greed. He wanted me to look down at him and see the innocent little boy who used to hold my hand. But I did not see my son anymore. I looked down at the top of his head, watching him weep pathetically against my boots, and I felt an agonizing, profound sorrow hollow out the center of my chest. I felt the absolute crushing finality of what this day truly meant. I had not just lost my wife to this evil conspiracy. I had lost my children. They had willingly let greed rot their souls until there was absolutely nothing left but selfishness and cowardice. I reached down with my rough, calloused hands. I did not stroke his hair. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I firmly grasped his wrists and physically pried his desperate fingers off my legs, pushing him firmly away from me. Agent Miller stepped forward quickly with a heavy pair of handcuffs. She hauled Jamal up from the floor, pulling his arm sharply behind his back. Jamal did not fight her. He just hung his head in defeat and wept loudly as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Miller said, her voice perfectly calm and professional as she read him his rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Across the room, the other agents were reading the exact same rights to Chloe and the corrupt notary. The overlapping authoritative voices reciting the Miranda warning created a surreal, echoing chorus in my dining room. I stood in the center of the wreckage, watching the federal agents methodically catalog the massive mountain of evidence I had provided. Agent Vance was carefully sliding the forged power of attorney, the offshore routing numbers, and Beatrice's medical records into clear plastic evidence bags. The sting operation had been a flawless, complete success. The recording device taped to my chest had captured every single damning word of Declan's confession and his explicit demands for my signature. The trap had slammed shut with bone-crushing force. Declan was finally hauled up from the floor by the two massive tactical agents. They dragged him to his feet, roughly holding him by his arms. His expensive custom suit was entirely ruined, ripped at the shoulder and covered in dirt and debris. His face was bruised and exceptionally pale. He looked at me, and the raw hatred burning in his dark eyes was absolute. He had lost everything: his stolen wealth, his freedom, his pristine reputation. And he knew exactly who had beaten him. He knew he had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed by the blue-collar shipyard worker he had so thoroughly despised. "You think you won, Calvin?" Declan spat, his voice dripping with venom as the agents pulled him toward the shattered front door. "You think this brings Beatrice back? You have nothing left. You are going to die completely alone in this empty house." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The tactical agents paused, letting me stand face to face with the man who had murdered my wife. I looked into his dead black eyes and felt the immense crushing weight of the past week finally begin to lift from my weary shoulders. The anger, the terror, the crushing grief, it all hardened instantly into a shield of pure, impenetrable iron. "I am not alone, Declan," I said, my voice a deep, steady rumble that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "I have the truth, and I have the satisfaction of knowing that you are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life locked inside a concrete box. You thought you could come into my home and steal my life, but you forgot that I spent 40 years building things that are meant to last. You built a weak house of cards, and I just blew it down." I turned my gaze, slowly looking at Chloe, who was weeping uncontrollably against the wall, and then at Jamal, who could not even lift his heavy head to meet my eyes. The profound, agonizing sorrow in my chest flared hot and bright, but I did not let it break me. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight, my broad shoulders squared. I looked at the two people I had raised, the two people I had loved more than anything in this world, and I severed the tie completely. "You killed your mother for a lifestyle you could not earn," I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality, echoing off the walls of the home I had lovingly built for them. "You traded your souls for dirty stolen money. You watched me grieve, and you tried to lock me away in the dark. You are no longer my children. You are just criminals. And you are going exactly where criminals belong." Chloe let out another agonizing, desperate wail, screaming for me to forgive her, begging for a second chance that she knew she would never, ever get. Jamal just sobbed quietly, his head hanging low in absolute total shame. "Take them out of my house," I said, looking directly at Agent Vance. Agent Vance nodded, his expression grim but deeply respectful. "Get them out of here," he ordered the tactical team. The agents moved forward, dragging the 4 prisoners toward the shattered front door. I watched as Declan Croft, the arrogant corporate shark who thought he was smarter than everyone else, was shoved roughly through the doorway and out into the cold morning air. I watched as they pushed him toward the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked in my concrete driveway. I watched as they forced his head down and shoved him into the back of a squad car, slamming the heavy metal doors shut behind him. His arrogance was completely destroyed. His fake empire was entirely dismantled. The trap I had built for him had crushed him into dust. 6 months passed before the heavy iron doors of justice finally slammed shut on the people who had murdered my wife. The federal courthouse in the city center was a massive, towering building of white marble and polished wood, completely devoid of warmth or comfort. I sat in the front row of the gallery every single day of the proceedings, watching the arrogance slowly drain out of Declan Croft. He tried to fight it, of course. He hired the most expensive defense attorneys money could buy, who tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance and misunderstanding. They tried to throw out the audio recordings and dismiss the paper trail as circumstantial evidence. But Agent Vance and Agent Miller had built a fortress of evidence so incredibly thick that no lawyer on earth could punch a hole through it. When the federal judge finally read the sentences, the packed courtroom went entirely silent. You could hear a pin drop on the polished hardwood floor. The judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. He called their actions a masterclass in calculated predatory cruelty. Declan received 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The charges were massive, including wire fraud felony, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit manslaughter in the death of my beautiful Beatrice. When the judge read that final charge, Declan actually collapsed back into his heavy wooden chair, his face completely buried in his shaking hands. He sobbed loudly, but nobody in the room felt an ounce of pity for him. He was a broken, pathetic shell of a man, stripped of his tailored suits and his stolen wealth. Dr. Sterling, the corrupt concierge physician who traded his sacred medical oath for blood money, lost his medical license permanently and was sentenced to 15 years behind bars. He wept openly in the courtroom, begging the judge for leniency, claiming he was manipulated. But the magistrate coldly reminded him that he had turned his healing hands into a calculated murder weapon for the sake of an offshore bank account. Then came my children, my own flesh and blood, standing before the judge in drab prison uniforms. Chloe stood trembling violently, her face pale and drawn. She tried to play the innocent victim right up until the very end, claiming Declan forced her into the scheme against her will, and that she loved her mother. The judge did not buy a single word of her theatrical performance, reading aloud the text messages where she mocked my grief. Chloe was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for her active role in the conspiracy and the deliberate cover-up. And Jamal, my quiet youngest son, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through college, received a 5-year sentence for accepting the hush money and participating in the elder abuse gaslighting. He looked at me one last time, mouthing an apology, but I just stared straight ahead. I watched the armed marshals lead them all away in heavy steel chains, hearing the doors click shut behind them. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I did not cheer or smile or pump my fist. I just felt a profound, heavy exhaustion settle deep into my bones. The painful surgery to remove the cancer from my family was finally complete, but the emotional scars would ache for the rest of my natural life. With the criminal trials successfully concluded, the federal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the elaborate financial web Declan had built over the years. Agent Miller personally oversaw the seizure of the Cayman Islands' offshore accounts, coordinating with international banking authorities to freeze every single hidden asset. Because Beatrice had been so incredibly meticulous in her documentation, tracing the exact routing numbers and identifying the hidden shell companies, the FBI was able to lock down the funds before a single cent could be transferred to South America. It took weeks of tedious legal paperwork, countless court filings, and international banking cooperation, but eventually the money was successfully repatriated to American soil. Victor Thorne Logistics Company received every single dollar of the stolen $1.5 million back into its corporate accounts, saving the business from absolute ruin and protecting the jobs of hundreds of innocent workers. Victor called me the very day the massive transfer cleared the bank. He sounded like a man who had just been given his life back from the brink of destruction. He told me that Beatrice's name had been entirely cleared of all wrongdoing in the corporate ledgers, and that he was setting up a permanent memorial scholarship in her honor to help young, disadvantaged women entering the accounting field. That beautiful news brought the first genuine tears of joy to my eyes in over half a year. Hearing her name honored instead of dragged through the mud was the greatest gift I could have asked for. As for my own finances, the recovery was complete and absolute. The $200,000 drained from my joint retirement accounts was restored in full, securing my financial future once again. The fraudulent power of attorney was officially dissolved by the courts wiping away Declan control forever, and the pending sale of my home was completely voided by a federal judge. I was standing in my sunlit kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning when the final legal notice arrived in the mail confirming that the house belonged solely and permanently to me. I walked slowly through the quiet, empty rooms of the house, touching the door frames and the wooden windowsills I had installed decades ago with my own two hands. The house no longer felt like a suffocating cage holding me hostage to my own children's greed. The dark, terrifying shadows of manipulation and terror had been swept clean by the harsh, cleansing light of truth. It was my sanctuary once again. I could finally sit in my worn brown leather recliner without constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who was watching me. I could drink my morning coffee and listen to the grandfather clock tick without anticipating a cruel psychological ambush from the people I loved. I had fought a brutal, exhausting war to protect the legacy Beatrice and I had built together, and I had emerged victorious against all odds. The 50-ton steel beam had crushed the predators and left the solid foundation of my home completely intact for the rest of my days. On a brilliantly sunny afternoon in late April, exactly 6 months after the federal raid, I drove my old, rusted Ford truck out to the quiet, peaceful cemetery on the edge of town. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of damp earth, fresh-cut grass, and blooming dogwood trees. I carried a massive bouquet of bright yellow roses in my rough, calloused hands. Yellow roses were always Beatrice's absolute favorite flower in the entire world. She used to say they looked like captured pieces of the warm summer sun bringing light into the darkest spaces. I walked down the gentle green slope listening to the birds singing in the high branches until I reached her resting place under a massive sprawling oak tree that provided deep, cool shade. I knelt down on the soft green grass and carefully placed the yellow roses at the base of the smooth gray granite headstone. I took a clean white cloth from my coat pocket and gently lovingly wiped away a few stray fallen leaves and bits of dirt from her beautifully carved name, tracing the letters with my fingertips. The stone was cool and solid beneath my hands, grounding me in the present moment and reminding me of the permanence of our love. I did it. Beatrice, I whispered into the quiet breeze, my voice thick with deep emotion but completely steady and calm. The trap worked flawlessly. Your brilliant, beautiful mind caught them all, and I dropped the steel right on their heads just like we planned. Your legacy is absolutely safe now, my love, untouched by their greedy hands. The people who hurt you, who stole your final days from us, are locked away in iron cages where they can never hurt anyone ever again. I told her all about Victor Thorne Corporate Scholarship and how her name would live on to help young women build honest careers. I told her about the house and how quiet and peaceful it was now without the heavy burden of lies and deception filling the hallways. I talked to her for over an hour, letting all the lingering pain, anger, and sorrow flow out of my heavy chest and sink deep into the earth. When I finally stood up, brushing the damp grass from my faded denim jeans, I felt a profound, incredible lightness wash over my entire being. The crushing, invisible weight I had carried since the moment I found her empty pill bottles was completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of closure. I walked back to my truck with a steady, confident step, breathing in the fresh spring air. I was 70 years old, but I was absolutely not finished living. I had decided to spend my remaining years turning my deep, agonizing pain into something useful for others. I had already signed up to volunteer 3 days a week at the local community center downtown. I was going to help educate other elderly folks on how to recognize the subtle, dangerous signs of financial abuse and predatory gaslighting by family members. I was going to teach them how to protect their hard-earned assets and their independence from people who saw their age as a weakness to be exploited for easy money. I was going to make sure that Beatrice's sacrifice meant something real and lasting to the world, and that no other senior citizen would have to face that darkness alone. I am telling you this story today because there is a harsh, undeniable reality in this world that too many good, trusting people ignore until it is entirely too late. Karma is a very real, unstoppable force in this universe, but sometimes it requires a willing pair of human hands to help deliver the final punishing blow. Greed is a blinding, intoxicating disease that corrupts the soul and destroys everything it touches. It makes arrogant people believe they are completely invincible and entirely above the law. It makes them look at a quiet, hard-working person and see nothing but a foolish, easy target waiting to be drained of everything they have ever worked for. Declan and my own children let their overwhelming greed completely blind them to the quiet, massive strength of the man they were foolishly underestimating. They thought because I was old and grieving the loss of my wife that I was weak, fragile, and defenseless against their schemes. They forgot that true strength is not about screaming, shouting, or throwing wild, violent punches in a fit of rage. True strength is about absolute, enduring patience. It is about locking your jaw and staying absolutely silent when everything inside you desperately wants to explode into a million pieces. It is about gathering your irrefutable proof, piece by piece in the dark, meticulously documenting every single lie, and waiting for the absolute perfect moment to let the heavy hammer fall on their heads. You must build your case with the cold mechanical precision of a veteran crane operator checking the heavy iron rigging before a massive, dangerous lift. You do not rush the process. You do not show your hand early, and you never let them see your anger. And when the timing is exactly right, you step back and you let absolute justice drop like a 50-ton steel beam directly onto their unsuspecting heads, crushing their lies into dust. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small, invisible, or helpless in your own home, regardless of who they are. Do not ever let someone convince you that your mind is failing or your memory is slipping just because you are growing older and choosing to trust the people around you. Your home is your personal sanctuary, and your dignity is absolutely not up for negotiation with anyone, not even your own flesh and blood. If you are watching this video right now and you suspect someone in your life is trying to manipulate you, gaslight you, or steal what you have spent a lifetime building, I want you to remember my story and find your inner courage. Stay incredibly sharp in the face of deception. Stay absolutely patient when they try to rush you. Document every single detail you can find, keep your evidence hidden, and do not be afraid to fight back with everything you have inside you. If this story resonated with you and brought you some sense of justice, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and fighting back against the darkness. And before you go, please drop a comment below letting me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. I read every single one of your messages, and your support means the absolute world to me. Stay sharp, stay patient, and always take care of yourselves.